Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third day of the Undercommons and Destituent Power Conference. On behalf of the organizing committee, we'd like to welcome everyone to this 4-day virtual conference. We're grateful to everyone who attended yesterday's panel on anti-politics and the self-defense of the surround, and we hope everyone will join us for the final panel tomorrow, Destitution and Collective Places of Life at 1 p.m. Eastern. I'd like to welcome our speakers for today's panel, our guests around the world, and give a special thank you to the other members of the conference organizing committee, namely Nicole Siegel, Rosinia, Kieran Ahrens, Bella Bravo, Nick Bergen, Ben Robinson, and J. Cameron Carter. This conference would not have been possible without the hard work of each of you, so thank you.
This conference aims to collect and share what we've learned from the practices and forms of life that are already breaking free of the catastrophic politics of our time. We've imagined this as a forum through which to pool strategic and conceptual responses to the twin crises that have overturned the global order this year: the pandemic and the uprisings. While rooted in the urgencies of the present, we also feel the importance of drawing upon deeper lineages of intellectual and political thought by weaving connections between the Black radical tradition and Italian autonomia, each of which signals a bifurcation and a rupture with established discourses rather than settled historical events or canons.
We'd also like to thank our sponsors and supporters: Indiana University's Institute for Advanced Study, its College Arts and Humanities Institute, the Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, and the Department of American Studies, and to the administrators who helped make the conference come together.
For today's session, we'll have 3 hours to talk and think together about hostility inside and around the fort. Reflecting the grave stakes of these discussions, we'd like to acknowledge the 3 people stabbed by white supremacists last night in the streets of DC and express our solidarity with them, as at least one of them remains in critical condition. This panel invites reflections on hostility, whether as enmity, ontological antagonism, class conflict, or internal escape into already existing interstices. It departs from Carl Schmitt's sense of the centrality of the state's enmity against its external other, the heart of the nomos, invisible during normal times, but revealing itself in the state of exception. Schmitt's recognition of the anomic foundation of constituent power reminds us that anomic formations are not in themselves necessarily liberatory. Taking up enmity, therefore, as a metaphysical foundation basic political problem, we look to civil war, the specter of which is still haunting us in this extended election season. The panel considers paramilitary violence as a potential vector of emancipatory or repressive violence, the shifting valence of destituent power as global corporations diffuse sovereign state power, the relationship of sovereign power to an undertheorized part of law, the jurisprudent outside that is blackness. Regardless of the focus on acrimony, the panelists' marvelous hope about the anarchic jurisgenerative character of blackness, the engagements already taking place in the continuous situations of emergency of global war, and the search for emancipatory violence in unlikely places position us in relation to the positive horizon that we yearn to envision with this conference. The discussion will be facilitated by Sam Law. After discussion between panelists, we'll have time set aside for question and answer from the audience.
If you'd like to ask a question to the panel, please write your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're asking that all questions are directed to the panel as a whole and not individual panelists to help cultivate a sense of commons. We'll collect your questions throughout this discussion and send them to Sam during the question and answer portion of the conversation in order to be most efficient.
Now I'd like to introduce Sam Law, our facilitator today. Sam Law is a graduate student in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. Working ethnographically with poor people's movements in Mexico City, he studies how autonomous responses to urban precarity contest contemporary modes of governance, generate new socio-territorial forms, reimagine ways of inhabiting the city, and generate novel emancipatory horizons that herald dignified and collective forms of life beyond the state and capital. Sam, thanks so much for facilitating this conversation.
All right, we'll pass it on to you, Sam.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Hugh and Mia. I want to start off by acknowledging the generous and tenacious spirit of the conference organizers who've made this mini conference possible despite all the odds and the cancellation of it in the spring. Kieran, Mia, Hugh, Nick, Jay, Bella, Nicole, Rose, and probably many others I haven't named who did the labor that made this possible. As Hugh said, today's panel is Hostility Inside and Around the Fort, Fugitive Approaches to COVID-era Conflict. From the now routine nature of the scattered skirmishes we saw on the streets of DC last night, the record sales of arms over the past months, the pervasive reign of police terror in communities across the country, to the immediate questions of survival and material reproduction that historic numbers of people are facing as this economy of cruelty casts them aside. The question of hostility has become an urgent and practical matter, a crucial site of questioning to understand and move within the tattered social fabrics of our time. It is to this question of hostility, broadly construed, that this panel turns. A brief note on format. We're going to have our 4 panelists speak in succession, and then at the end, we're going to have time for questions and hopefully a sort of nice improvisational space of discussion. And unlike in the past panels of this conference, we're going to today be able to elevate previous panelists to join us. So people who presented in previous days should be able to actually join in speaking, not just in the chat. But we'll also be fielding questions from the chat, and hopefully the chat can be a lively, anyone, sorry, I did not understand. Yes, anyone will be able to be elevated. So we'll actually be able to really open up this space to be more dialogic than it has been in the past. So today's panel is going to begin with Edgar Ias, who will be presenting his paper, Destituent Power, Global War and Survival. Edgar Ias is an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Indiana University, Bloomington. His field of specialization is contemporary Catalan culture, and I might add that he's a self-identified partisan of the Catalan cause. His research interests also lie in political theory, Marxism, biopolitics, and war studies. He's published Thinking Barcelona, Ideologies of a Global City in 2012, and The Survival Regime, Global War and the Political, which obviously bears much on our current discussion today, as well as various articles on global capitalism and politics and architecture in Catalonia. And I will turn it over to you, Edgar.
All right, great. Thank you, Sam. Can you hear me now? Yes. All right. Well, thank you. Yes, my reflection today has to do with survival. This thing that I examined in this book, The Survival Regime. And basically, what I do is to explore survival as a political category and so on. And then what I'll do today is to try to link survival to destituent power and war and some of the topics that we've been discussing. I hope this is helpful. So I'll start. In this intervention, I want to reflect on the difficulty of thinking the potentiality of destituent power in a global world in which state power is itself being destituted by the well-known logics of neoliberalism and global war. The force of destituent power lies on its capacity to undermine sovereign power. Yet if corporate capitalism today already accomplishes the diffusion of sovereignty, then the effectiveness of destituent power and the related forms of disobedience, exodus, or what Deleuze and Guattari called lines of flight becomes more uncertain. Rather than abandoning these notions, however, I propose to reinscribe them into another dominant form of politics today, a form made of eclectic and singular struggles for survival. The destitution of sovereign power does not simply refer to the privatization of social services and the neoliberal dismantling of the welfare state. This dismantling is part of a deeper destabilization of the principle of protection in exchange for obedience. Carl Schmitt famously identified this principle as the basis of the modern state. As he says in the concept of the political, protergo ergo obligo is the cogito ergo sum of the state. A further genealogy can help us interpret this principle beyond the modern state as a secularization of the Christian articulation of pure obedience. In Security, Territory, Population, Foucault shows how Christianity redefined obedience as a type of conduct, I quote, in which the essence of its raison d'etre is in itself. Christian obedience is subordination to someone because he is someone, so that one obeys in order to be obedient, in order to arrive at the state of obedience. Thus, the circularity of Christian obedience acts as a precondition for the emergence of the obligation to obey the state. Similarly, the transaction between obedience and protection can be interpreted as a secularization of the implicit transaction of Christianity, whereas obedience of faith leads to the peace of eternal life, civil obedience to the state leads to peaceful life on earth. Given this theological political articulation, any transformation of political power in modernity necessarily contained a moment of disobedience. This moment could take different forms. One was the anti-colonial uprisings that generated the constituent power to create new countries, as exemplified by the American Revolution, the independence movements in Latin America, and the post-colonial nationalisms of the 20th century. Another was the slave rebellion, such as the seminal Haitian Revolution, which struggled to change the institutional frames of exploitative racism. Another was the civil disobedience that pursued change without questioning the systemic logic, as in Thoreau, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. Naturally, another paradigmatic form was the proletarian revolution that followed the Leninist path of seizing state power. Indeed, as Adam Sidzi has observed, disobedience is the apparatic basis of modern politics to work. If the political in modernity is based on the state principles of equality, reason, and the will of the people, then the imperative of obedience enables the operativity of these principles by positing disobedience as exterior to them. Subjective freedom, for instance, is the fundamental validation of sovereign power and simultaneously opens up the space for disobeying state law. The legal order, on the one hand, and individual and collective disobedience, on the other hand, establish a dialectical relationship by which the latter disputes the former to destitute it, alter it, amend it, and finally reinstitute it. Yet in the global world, the contract between protection and obedience has lost preeminence and effectiveness. The neoliberal assault on the state has dismantled its monopoly on violence, so many aspects of protection, healthcare, the prison system, the business of war, have been handed over to private agents, corporations, and individual citizens. An evident example of this shift is the end of the military draft, the contract of modern states by which citizens are sent to war to defend their country has been replaced by the commercial transaction between state companies and individuals that enroll voluntarily in the army. This privatization of war is a visible aspect of the structural transformation of power in globalization. Carlo Galli has defined this change as global war. Galli argues that in previous historical periods, war was an event spatially and temporally limited. In interstate wars, and even in the 20th century total wars of extermination, the antagonistic sides could still be spatialized along the axis of enmity. In globalization, by contrast, the endless and boundless character of violence has generated an anomic spatiality. That is, an order of disorder, or what Galli calls a contradiction without system, caused by the global socialization of violence. The erratic operations of terrorism, the chronification of violence in the Middle East, the inherent link between destruction and production in the narco wars in Central America, or similarly, the profitable nature of police brutality in the US, are daily examples of a kind of unmediated circulation of violence that mixes politics, capital, and social life. Violence, in other words, no longer produces political forms that can contain it. Clausewitz's maxim, war is the continuation of politics by other means, needs to be amended. In globalization, war and politics have become the means for the continuation of each other. Galli refuses to attribute this diffuse violence to capitalism. For him, the problem of Marxism is that it continues to offer a, I quote, monocausal reading of globalization, whereas global war defines the disappearance of an ultima ratio or structural last instance. Yet this problem is more paradoxical than Galli concedes. If global war has no nomos, no space, then this means that anything, state power, capital, war itself, can have a structural function at a given point. Where there is anarchy, anything can produce a type of provisional order. Or better, the very indeterminate disorder of globalization entails that disorder is the immanent order of things. That is, the blurred complexes of capital, politics, and war compose in an immediate way the structure of the system. We usually interpret these complexes of disorder as a product of neoliberalism, but this term still assumes that the market rationality governs the present order. The fundamental feature of the present order of disorder is that it has destabilized all modern rationalities. In the same way, many sociological terms have attempted to define the changes in state form in globalization. Terms such as denationalized state, failed state, rock state, petrostate, narco-state, militia state, quasi-state, parastate, and pseudo-state. These are very useful to describe specific cases and dynamics. And yet, is such a profusion of terms not a sign of the difficulty of the delimiting state power that has disseminated through assemblages of politics, money, and violence? These assemblages have generated an anomic spatiality in which all the categorical distinctions of domination and exploitation have conflated. So in this global chaos of war, what is there to destitute? After this diffusion of sovereignty, what kind of potentiality does destituent power hold for us? Agamben's potenza destituente brings forth the power of the form of life. Form of life designates, I quote, a life that cannot be separated from its form, a life for which, in its way of living, what is at stake is living itself, end quote. This does not mean that natural biological life contains political agency in itself. Rather, Agamben finds in this way of living the potentiality of inoperativity, that is, the contemplative but also active task of evacuating sovereign power and its biopolitical command over bare life. Thus, even if Agamben's destituent power aims to distinguish itself from the constituent power that can be redirected to the foundation of another constituted power, his form of life continues to arise out of sovereignty. Indeed, he acknowledges in Homo Sacer that, I quote, from the point of view of sovereignty, only bare life is authentically political, end quote. In this respect, is the politicization of bare life as form of life not the reverted form of the sovereign gesture par excellence? Thus, form of life as potentiality not continue to assume that sovereignty continues to be the cause and locus of political agency. This potentiality was useful and even necessary in the historical situation to which Agamben was responding. This was the moment of total war and the biopolitical total state of the 20th century that culminated the Western logics of sovereignty. As he put it in Homo Sacer, the concentration camp epitomized the biopolitical nomos of the mother. In the anomie of global war, however, sovereignty is diffused among networks of corporate capital and industrial complexes of war. If sovereignty loses the monopoly to decide on the exception and is therefore no longer properly sovereign, then the biopolitical rationale of the modern state cannot be implemented. Without sovereign control, the state can no longer pursue the purification and immunization of the social body. Consequently, today's assemblages of war, capital, and state power are post-biopolitical. Or more precisely, since these assemblages do not follow an ultimate rationale, all modern rationales, the logic of capitalist accumulation, the political distinction between friend and enemy, and the biopolitical logic of purification, fold up onto each other to create magmatic enclaves of power in permanent conflict with themselves. How has this global reallocation of sovereignty changed the task of evacuating power? To continue the work of destituent power in a post-sovereign world, it may be useful to reconceptualize it according to another dominant form of the political today, namely what I propose to call the regime of survival. What is survival? Three meanings immediately come to mind. The first definition is that survival is not a political category, but rather defines the pre-political condition that precedes the state, or what Hobbes called the war of all against all. Survival here is mere struggle for life, and there is nothing political in it. Second, the thinkers of biopolitics, Foucault, Agamben, Roberto Esposito, taught us that this exclusion of survival from political life precisely defined the essence of the political in modernity. The exclusion of biological life paradoxically inserted survival, or bare life, into the center of politics, thus transforming power into biopower. Within this paradigm, survival became associated with the courageous attempts to resist the biopolitical control of the state, especially after its most extreme manifestation, the Holocaust, which produced the subsequent theorizations of the figure of the survivor by writers such as Primo Levi and Elias Canetti. Finally, a third meaning of survival arises from its relationship with neoliberalism, whether in the celebratory ideology of the survival of the fittest, or as condemnation of the reduction of life to economic survival. Here the category aims to describe a non-political or post-biopolitical economic sphere, or what Wendy Brown calls the vanquishing of homo politicus by homo economicus. My hypothesis is that the regime of survival in global war incorporates but also dissolves these three previous concepts. Survival takes place in war, but not in a pre-political war. This is rather a hyper-political war where individual or collective struggles for survival have direct political meaning. Hyper-politicization goes further than the personal is political. The site of politics is not identity or subjectivity, but the movements of bodies as they struggle to live on. Similarly, survival in global war no longer resembles the traumatic existence of genocide victims and survivors. Survival is also surrounded by a sense of catastrophe, but the danger of approaching death and the rapid movements to escape it generate excitement and impetuosity. Rather than the paralyzing temporality of trauma, the temporality of survival is one of post-apocalyptic liberation and aleatory encounters with more intensity than dwelling, more action than conversation. Finally, survival meshes with the ideologies of resilience and the survival of the fittest, as it presupposes the need to stay afloat in the capitalist market. But this does not entail the disappearance of politics. Rather, this condition is again hyper-political through and through. What kind of politics does survival produce? Survival lays the emphasis on the struggle. The forms of life of survival do not necessarily emerge from a negative act of deactivation or inoperativity, as in Agamben. Right? Rather, these are positive struggles of self-defense to live on in a world without the state contract between protection and obedience. Survival responds to the arbitrary control of the complexes of capital, sovereign power, and war that have absorbed the modern state. These complexes produce an unstable and internally antagonistic governmentality. Power can be very protective at certain moments and totally indifferent in others. It demands full obedience or it accepts flagrant disloyalty depending on the conflict at stake. Post-sovereign power is unpredictable because it occupies a contradictory position. It is vulnerable because it must respond to multiple constant threats, and it is enormously powerful because it can justify indiscriminate repression by appealing to the situation of exceptionality. The politics of survival does not necessarily seek a counterpower to resist these complexes. Rather, it is made of heterogeneous interventions that engage in constant battle without resulting in stable, politically formalized spaces. Survival engages in the internal antagonisms of these complexes so that it may embrace a capitalist interest to attack a state policy or vice versa. Or if it wages a war against both capital and state, then it inevitably participates in the industrial production of war. This type of degree zero politics has no preset directives, and it cannot be reduced to a single path, not even the open path of destituent power, because it responds to the unpredictability of the anomic complexes of capital, war, and sovereignty. Who are the subjects of survival? Agamben theorized the destituent power of bare life after the figure of the Jewish Holocaust survivor, the person who has been stripped of all qualified life and yet who continues to embody a messianic promise, an identity of non-identity, a singularity that no state power, no matter how totalitarian, can ever control or kill. As he writes in The Use of Bodies, the messianic, I quote, does not represent a new and more universal identity, but a caesura that passes through every identity. It is the impossibility of every identity of coinciding with itself, namely their destitution as identities, Jew as non-Jew, Gentile as non-Gentile. End of quote. Survival, by contrast, displaces the questions of identity and otherness and articulates post-subjective figures or agencies around two main axes. First, the production of a distinction, a temporary and confrontational us versus them. And second, the embrace of the strict facticity of being there, or being here, not there, being here. The figures of survival arise from the combative affirmation of being a body. These figures are the undocumented immigrants that proclaim, aquí estamos y no nos vamos. We are here and we are not leaving. They are the Black Lives Matter assemblies of people who gather and expose their bodies to stop being shot by the police. They are the maroon undercommons who, as Motten and Harney write, are always at war, always in hiding. They are Chelsea Manning when she tweeted against Trump's anti-transgender policies, I quote, laws don't determine our existence is our law. And they are my 92-year-old grandmother when she defied the violence of the Spanish police and went to cast her vote on the Catalan referendum of independence. Survival are the refugees, the precariat, and well, what about the white underclasses that carry their weapons and their tram flags to the street? Are they not trying to survive too? This brief list of examples is indicative of the irresolute ideology of the work of survival. Survival offers no directions or principles, so it is neither progressive nor reactionary. Survival is not a content for politics, nor is it the basis for some type of anthropolitics or bioprogram. It does not fill up the political, but rather empties out of programmatic directives and future exigencies. This openness makes possible the articulation of political action and transforms all practices into effective militancy and consequential interventions. Survival does not follow a pristine ethical notion, but gets dirty in the muddled terrain of politics. One last example can show us the self-contradictory essence of survival. Earlier this year, in the negotiation between the US and the Afghan governments to end the military occupation of Afghanistan, And here we have the first contradiction, the realization that Trump got closer to end another endless war, as he may have done with North Korea. So one of the main points of contention is how much amnesty should the Taliban receive. In an interview on NPR, a shopkeeper in Kabul expressed her worry that if the Americans left and many Taliban prisoners were released, she would have to close her shop and hide at home again. What is the progressive position in this predicament? Is this dramatic situation not a perfect representation of the collapse of the political categories that we have inherited from modernity and the need to survive among catastrophic solutions? To end on a happier note, the liberatory aspect of this collapse is that it forces us to engage in the political conflicts that are always already taking place. In these conflicts, acts of survival are impure mixtures of progressive and reactionary contents. We have no assurance that our actions will transform the world, but for this reason, our permanent critical and militant engagement is all the more vital and necessary. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you for that, Edgar. That was a wonderful first paper to start off this panel. Next up, we have Brian Whitner. Brian teaches in the Spanish program at the University of South Alabama. He is the author of Crisis Cultures, The Rise of Finance in Mexico and Brazil, out last year from the University of Pittsburgh Press. Other projects include Face Down, De Gente Común, Arte Política y Rebeldía Social, and as a participant in the Maria Rosa Collective, Brian has participated in the English translations of Thought, Actions, Practices by Grupo de Arte Callejero, The Empire of Neo-Memory by Heriberto Yepes, and Genocide in the Neighborhood by Colectivo Situaciones. I'm going to hand it over to Brian for his presentation.
Hello, everyone. Just give me a quick shout out in the chat that you can hear me okay. Just give me a quick thumbs up. There was no poet today, so I thought maybe I would start with some poetry because I just thought that was a great part of yesterday. And I'm gonna actually start with a poem by Rock Dalton, who was a revolutionary. Some of you maybe, I won't say any more about it, but there's multiple reasons why we would maybe think about his work on a day like today. And I'm gonna just read real quickly, cede a little bit of my time to some poetry and read a short poem called Like You. Like you, I love love, life, the sweet smell of things, the sky blue landscape of January days. And my blood boils up and I laugh through eyes that have known the buds of tears. I believe the world is beautiful and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. And that my veins don't end in me, but in the unanimous blood of those who struggle for life, love, little things, landscape and bread, the poetry of everyone. So I just want to say real quickly, thank you to everyone who organized, to all the prior presenters, to everyone who's out there in the audience, who's produced this like wonderful event. I'm very excited to be here and excited to see where the conversation takes us today. And also I just want to emphasize something that was mentioned at the outset, that it would be, lots of people are able to participate today. So definitely feel free to jump in when we get to the discussion section. It would be wonderful to have lots of voices as we're kind of moving towards the end of the conference to begin doing some, collective thinking together. I'm going to try and share my screen with you all. Okay, I can't share my screen with you all. There is an image on your screen right now. This is going to be a little bit more poetry of a group of police in Asheville, North Carolina, on June the 3rd of this year, Just imagine a line of police defending a territory. Okay, maybe I can do it now. Thank you so much, Rose. I appreciate you. Yeah, so you can see this image now, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about this image to begin my presentation today. So this image is from June 3rd, 2020 at a George Floyd protest in Asheville, North Carolina. And what it shows perhaps should surprise us. Here we see agents of the state, those tasked with the dispensation of lethal force, attacking water bottles. So many among us might be able to make sense of this scene, to be able to intuit the situational context, the ends and strategic objectives, the balance of forces that led cops to this position and set of actions. Nevertheless, I want to hold on to the scene's fundamental strangeness, that the lethal agents of the state attacking harmless plastic bottles, perhaps replacing them with any other everyday item, a teddy bear. Oh, you know, I'm so sorry. I totally forgot to say that there's a content warning, that I will be talking a little bit about police violence in this talk. I'm so sorry. I completely skipped over that. And I know lots of people have been in contact with that recently. So I just want to kind of give everybody a heads up. It's not at the center of what I'm doing, but it's there. So I'm totally sorry about that. Let me just back up real quickly then. So I want to try and hold on to the fundamental strangeness of this scene, which is these lethal agents of the state attacking plastic water bottles. So replacing them with any other item, a teddy bear, a bouquet of flowers, a ball emblazoned with a smiley face, might restore the strangeness if it's hard to find, but it should be partially accessible in the excessive contrast between 30 armed riot police, their seriousness, the tension of their bodies, their defense of a perimeter, and the target of their fearful rage, bottles. And what I want to do in this talk is explain how we got to a place where highly paid agents of state violence are unleashing lethal force against a beverage or against an infrastructure of social reproduction, because this water was a part of a medic clinic. And to talk a little bit about what this might mean for the understanding of the contemporary terrain of struggle. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the. We live in a moment that's marked by expanding and mutating forms of state and capital violence. No longer are there discussions like in 2012 where there are limits, whether there are limits on police violence, proportionality as it's known in just war theory. In the present, cities declare that the police will no longer shoot tear gas into innocent crowds, except they do. We could just list a series of things, which I'm not actually going to do right now, of contradictions. And at the same time, we also live in a moment of the proliferation of actors, whether those be, we could just reference to things that happened last night, and there's a list of those actors that I could read. A proliferation of actors who enact lethal violence in explicit concert or with the implicit approval of some part of the state apparatus or wealthy elites. Cops attacking water bottles, and the state and capital creating conditions in which far-right groups and individuals can perpetrate violence are two sides of one coin, or counterinsurgency program. So in my talk, I want to use this image that I just showed you to explore counterinsurgency as the dominant frame of state and capital violence after 1960 in the Americas, center the importance of attacks on social reproduction within the counterinsurgency tradition, and ask from what histories of struggle a proposal of counterinsurgency could emerge from. But first, a word about liberalism. So it's not without good reason that most of the work on violence in the last half century has focused on supplementing liberal notions of violence as the opposite of politics. In 1969, Joan Gatland coined the term structural violence to give a name to forms of violence, quote, built into the structure of society, which show up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. Since then, we have Nixon's work on slow violence, Rogers and O'Neill on infrastructural violence, Boehmer and Davies on planned violence, Berlant on the ordinariness of contemporary violence, just to name a few. Each of these terms attempts to name a confusion inherent in liberal theories of violence, supposedly constrained to a monopoly of armed force of the state, but yet strangely everywhere. Liberalism, whether in its imperial or democratic formulations, has a compulsion to hide the violence it depends on. Capitalism depends on violence and coercion, and liberalism is at pains to distract from, diminish, and deflect the centrality of capitalist violence. In liberal democratic theory, violence has a contaminating effect upon politics and as such must be excluded from it. Violence is the other of representational politics. But as anyone who has ever been to a demonstration or has held a minimum wage job knows, punishment, harassment, and violence are the bread and butter of social ordering and of accumulation. Liberal states generate a hypocrisy between their theory and their practice, between a theory of the exclusion of violence from politics and its proliferation everywhere as the state and capital attempt to order and accumulate. This means also that liberal theory, which is the hegemonic theory of violence in the United States, and I think in the Americas, which deeply influences all discussion of violence, collapses kitchen sinks and babies and bathwater into its category of violence. Killings by the police, domestic abuse, the taking up of arms in national liberation struggles, mass actions in the streets are all labeled, discussed, and frequently belittled, devalued, or condemned as violence. Whatever violence is, in liberal theory, it has no history. Realist political theory, a la Machiavelli, sketches differently the relation. Violence is always a part of politics, its extension, it's a partner in a continuum, where ends justify means. And in emancipatory struggle, I would submit that, as Mark Neoclis has noted, much theory, our theories of violence, takes as its starting point liberal theory. And I'd like to begin from a different position. Structures and actions that uphold the miserable world of state and capital are violent. Anything that would oppose those worlds is a force. The Nicaraguan revolutionary Humberto Ortega theorized the Sandinista struggle as an active accumulation of forces. I prefer force because we tend to use it automatically in the plural, a balance of forces, accumulation of forces, and because its history and resonance are immediately within the field of strategy and tactics or practical action in problems, which is where force operates within the history of emancipatory struggle. Force is never without a context, never without an end, even if only a horizon or a hope. So repurposing Weber, we could say states and capital have a monopoly on violence, which they constantly want to disavow. Part of the struggle on the level of the concept is to say, where there is a state, where there is capital, there is violence. For liberationists, abolitionists, emancipationists, actions on the plane of tactics and strategy or practical action are forces tethered to a horizon of active accumulation. So returning to our photo, does this violence have a history? In processes and governance of governance and accumulation, there have always been in colonial, imperial, neo-colonial, and globalizing formations the need for small wars, settler violence, paramilitaries, guardias blancas. And if we move beyond the liberal democratic frame of the nation state and its supposed monopoly on violence and an obsessive focus on formal armies and the police, we can see this continuity between liberal empire and liberal democracy. It allows us to see not only state violence, but capital violence, and shifts our starting point from aberrations or departures from a failed monopoly on violence to the questions of where is violence and what is it doing? Within this continuity, however, there are historical inflections, specific technologies of violences that are necessary to distinguish, in particular in order to understand our photo. In the Americas, the most important change in the doctrine and practice of state and capital violence was the introduction and then formalization of counterinsurgency and counterterror, which occurred at the end of World War II and was formalized during the Kennedy administration. Michael McClintock's Instruments of Statecraft, U.S. Guerrilla Warfare, Counterinsurgency, and Counterterrorism, 1940 to 1990, demonstrates how Kennedy put counterinsurgency at the heart of US military practice. And I'm just going to read a little bit just to give you kind of a sense of how far back some of these traditions go and also how similar they are perhaps to things that we think about today. So McClintock writes, as the Eisenhower administration's Cuban and Congolese operations ground inexorably into 1961, the new president moved rapidly to make his own mark on the Cold War, building on the experience of the 1950s, but with a difference. Kennedy was not content to rely on the covert stratagems of the CIA. Rather, he was determined to wage the Cold War on a far broader front. While the CIA retained its paramilitary role despite the turn of events at the Bay of Pigs, the regular armed forces were charged with taking up the paramilitary, unconventional cudgel of the Cold War in ways almost unthinkable before. The Eisenhower emphasis on offensive, unconventional, covert war against undesirable elements was matched by Kennedy's overt and covert war on the internal enemies of friendly governments. This latter task, the counterinsurgency dimension of political warfare, became a principal plank of Kennedy's foreign policy. So in formulating and placing counterinsurgency at the heart of US military practice, the Kennedy administration and its practitioners drew on a long tradition of colonial violence. As McClintock writes, describing the counterinsurgency manual that was produced by the US government in 1960, and I'll quote again, the elements of the counterinsurgency program mapped out in 1960 were not themselves innovations. The innovation was in the generalized subordination of the tactics and techniques of counterinsurgency to the fundamental principle of fighting like with like. The extra-legal element of the approach was justified only on the grounds of expediency and the expectations of the adversary. And quoting from the manual, basically the guerrilla terrorist mentally acknowledges and accepts his status as an illegal person whose life is forfeit if apprehended. And in a further departure from the post-Korea manuals of the 1950s, this 1960 manual explicitly prescribed the use of guerrilla and terrorist methods. Principles of operation, quoting again from the manual, stress maintenance of the initiative by prompt offensive action, economy of force, and employment of suitably organized and trained troops and police in all weather field operations, utilizing guerrilla terrorist tactics. So I don't have time in this talk to show how these ideas filtered forward during the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st, how they were taken up anew and spread even deeper into US and global militaries and police departments by the Reagan administration, and how right from the beginning of US counterinsurgency, the doctrine was applied into the United States in the COINTEL program, which began in 1956. Stuart Schrader's Badges Without Borders tells a part of this story. Rather, I just want to point real quickly to three tendencies or intensifications within counterinsurgency practice from 1960 to the present. First, it shifted the role of states from actors to creators of the possibility for violence. Second, counterinsurgency was directly tied to notions of terror and trauma. The point of violence ceased to be the defeat of the enemy, rather the point became social destabilization, the terrifying of a populace into submission. And finally, US counterinsurgency, like all counterinsurgency, sees itself as a war against social reproduction, whether that be against the bands of guerrilla fighters or against the communities that support them. What the photo from Asheville shows us is a classic counterinsurgency technique, attack the means of social reproduction of a movement. And so the history behind this photo is long indeed. So I'm gonna just kind of try and jump through real quickly the rest of the parts of this argument, and we can talk more about it in the discussion that follows. So my argument is that there is a direct and an immediate connection in between counterinsurgency and attacks on social reproduction. Social reproduction, as theorized by Marxist feminists in the 1970s and by more contemporary writers, can be understood to mean a given group's psychic, material, and cultural means of producing the day-to-day conditions of their survival. However, if we look at the classic texts of the emancipatory or revolutionary tradition, there is very little emphasis placed on social reproduction. Mao, perhaps I saw somebody in the chat already doing that, that gorillas must be like the fish in the water of the people. That's actually the only place in that entire book that Mao talks about that relationship of an idea of social reproduction to an idea of struggle. And I could go through many other of the texts in the tradition and show that that is not there. So it raises a question for us. And the question is, how do we account for that absence if counterinsurgency is so focused on attacks on social reproduction? How do we account for that absence? And let me just, in the last section, let me just say a few things about that. First, in the classic texts in the emancipatory tradition, they assume a sector of self-sufficient producers. And many of these counterinsurgency practices, while drawing on longer imperial and colonial traditions, were in fact developed, intensified, and spread largely in response to the success of things like Mao's People War and also the Cuban Revolution. So I want to propose that these are two great deficits facing emancipatory thought and practice in the present. First, in the context of urban struggles in the Americas, a pre-existing peasant or smallholder surplus is not available to sustain struggle. That infrastructure must be built. Second, it must be done under difficult conditions in which states and capital have had decades of practice in sniffing out, targeting, and subsuming such infrastructures. To these two deficits, I'd add a third problem, which is that as counterinsurgency techniques have spread throughout the Americas, they become increasingly aimed at destabilization or at producing conditions of psychological trauma and physical and material destitution, or producing order through instability. Again, the classic texts are silent here, and I think that this isn't something that we need to think about, and I want to put some emphasis here because this is a place that I felt difference with some of the previous talks. I don't know how much I see the US state as being a biopolitical, successfully administrative machine. Rather, it seems to be an apparatus that increasingly orders via destabilization, or that achieves accumulation through forms of destabilization. That's something I would love to talk about more. What this implies, by way of conclusion, is that a turn away from this kind of classic corpus of emancipatory text to traditions where the problem of mobile provisional infrastructures of social reproduction are theorized or practiced. Daniel Nimser, in a talk he was going to present at this conference, points to Maroon communities as one such site in tradition. Drawing on Harney and Moten's work on the undercommons and their idea of fugitive planning, Nimser writes, and I quote, "In contrast to the infrastructures laid down by imperial logistics, which are fixed, governable conduits for capital dripping with blood and dirt, the infrastructures of fugitivity are solid but provisional, portable, dispensable. They assemble a mobile place," quoting Stefano and Harney, or Harney and Moten, sorry. "They assemble a mobile place from which to plan." So to venture a thesis by way of conclusion, a political moment, an insurgency, lasts only as long as its infrastructures of social reproduction allow for. And I'm not the first person to point to this connection. Amanda Armstrong did in 2012 in an essay, "Debt and the Student Strike," which is no longer in print, but which someone should republish. My sense is that only with tactics and strategies aimed at the construction of temporal, provisional, mobile, scalable infrastructures of social reproduction could there be an active accumulation of forces. This accumulation has two limits, one from above, or repression, the other from below, or the infrastructures of care and abundance that ingenuity and commitment will allow to be built. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful exciting paper and the beautiful poetry that began it. We're going to move now to Melayna Lamb. Melayna Lamb is a writer and academic based in London, and she currently teaches at the University of Sussex in the School of Law, Politics, and Sociology. She was awarded her PhD last year for a thesis entitled On Order and the Exception, a Philosophical History of Police Power. And I'm excited to say that she's turning it into a monograph so we can all read it in book form. And she's also the co-author of a other very exciting sounding book, Policing the Pandemic, How Public Health Becomes Public Order, which will be out with Bristol University Press next year. So without further ado, I turn it over to Melayna.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to have this conversation. And firstly, just a caveat, this is very much a work in progress that I'm about to present to you. And it's not, a coherent, fully fledged argument yet, but hopefully it will provoke some conversation and some interesting things to talk about in the Q&A. So that's my main hope, rather than presenting a fully coherent paper to you now. Okay, so the law and its outside, the threshold of law and non-law has been subject to huge amounts of theoretical exposition and investigation, variously figured as violence, nature, natural violence, and the violence of nature. Throughout much of Western political thought, there is the notion that what stands between chaotic violence, a war of all against all, is the existence of the state, and in particular, the police. The sovereign standing outside of the law, but rendering it operative, annexes an outside of the law to the law, thus making the lawless outside immanent to the law through the exception. So if, as thinkers such as Benjamin and Agamben claim, the law is sustained by and lives off of the exception, and furthermore that the exception that has become the rule, then the task of abolishing the law remains an elusive one. It is thought that sovereign power places itself outside of the law whilst maintaining it through the figure of the exception. But if the outside is repeatedly brought inside via the machinations of sovereign violence, then thinking an outside that is, in Moten's words, doubly outside is crucial. So it is this jurisgenerative capacity, peculiar creativity predominantly ascribed to sovereignty, that is associated with the threshold of law and non-law, that Moten argues has been subject to a massive historical mislocation. It is blackness, he writes, not sovereignty, that is anarchically jurisgenerative. And in doing this, he builds on Robert Cover, for whom jurisgenesis is not an exclusive property of the state, but who instead argues that, quote, there is a multiplicity of laws, the fecundity of the jurisgenerative principle that creates the problem to which the court and the state are the solution, end quote. Indeed, for Cover, it is not that the state is even particularly well suited to jurisgenesis, but rather it is jurispathic, that is, willing to impose a single law through violence. And the relationship of law to violence has been well documented and analysed. But here I want to note that law is usually figured in an oppositional relation to anarchy. We find this in, for example, Carl Schmitt, who famously locates a jurisgenerativity in sovereign power, whereby the sovereign's decision on the exception emanates from nothingness. Unmediated by any legal norm and not referencing anything outside of itself, Schmitt's decisionism attributes all creative and inaugural force to the sovereign who decides whether there is an exception and what to do in the face of it. There is here an anomic outside to the law that is annexed to the legal order by the sovereign via the exception. That is, the space outside of and devoid of law is transformed by sovereign power by the decision which decides whether or not the normal legal order exists. In Schmitt's own words, quote, what characterizes an exception is principally unlimited authority, which means the suspension of the entire existing order. In such a situation, it is clear that the state remains, whereas law recedes. Because the exception is different from anarchy and chaos, order in the juristic sense still prevails, even if it is not of the ordinary kind. We thus find in political theology a tripartite distinction between juristic chaos or anarchy, the exception or extraordinary order, and the legal system that exists in a normal situation. So if the state of exception is constitutive of the legal order itself, this process is anchored to the idea of an anomic outside to the law, a space and time devoid of law, an anomic space and time of juridical rule. Given its law founding properties, then, the state of exception is anomic, but not anarchic. What then of the anarchic? The OED tells us that its definition is both a condition without government and a state of disorder. Impressed and embossed on the English language itself, then, are the marks of a political theological inheritance, one which presumes that government is the source of order. In very brief and general terms, it is thought that with the advent of modernity, order, which had once been secure, natural, and inevitable, becomes something that, far from being guaranteed, needs to be produced. Here, the thought of Hobbes is taken as transforming the Greek and theological account of order as natural or divine into one that is artificial, to be manufactured by sovereignty. The oppositional relation, then, and Schmitt and Hobbes knew this well, between order and anarchy, states of nature and sovereignty, must be figured as functional, lest the reason for being of states, police, and laws be fatally undermined. However, it is also not the case that natural order disappears entirely, but rather it is thought that it re-emerges with classical liberalism and political economy as the structuring force behind households, markets, and the economy. And encompassing these three terms is oikonomia. Very briefly, I'll just sketch out what oikonomia is for those unfamiliar. Oikonomia, or the management of the household as it appears in Aristotle, is defined in contradistinction to the realm of the polis. As such, we find a scission between the house and the city, or oikonomia and politics. Aristotle articulates a qualitative distinction between the government of free men and the government of the household, in opposition to those who would argue that ruling a household is just a difference in numbers to ruling a polis. He goes on to argue that rule in a household is monarchical, since every house has one ruler, while the rule of statesmen is rule over free and equal persons. This notion, in its beginnings, thus points to a non-political realm, one that requires a different modality of governance from that of the polis. At the very foundation of Western political thought, then, there is a split between the ecos and the polis, and it is this that is crucial for the development of a mode of governing that was a mode of groundless praxis, contingent actions, not subject to the rules of the polis. As Agamben writes, it is activities that are decisions and orders that cope with the problems that are each time specific and concern for the functional order of the different parts of the ecos. Matters of household governance, then, lie beyond the realm of justice, and in this sense are not concerned with rules and laws as such. The task of the householder in this paradigm of oikonomia is to maximize the welfare of the household, and in so doing, they may have recourse to whatever they see fit in order to attain this outcome. This constitutes a realm of contingency, then, and a managerial form of governance that is, as it were, ex nihilo, not referencing law or justice for its necessity, but order alone. It is often argued that during the course of the 19th century and into the 20th, political economy became detached from the model of the household and its relevance for modern politics all but excised. However, precisely what is captured by oikonomia, the rule of the household, is the play of necessity. There is no need here to reference a higher law or a notion of justice, because any action taken for the order and preservation of the household is a priori justified. So household governance, far from disappearing, becomes, as Angela Metropoulos argues, the basis for reactionary law and order politics. Furthermore, this oikonomaic form of governing is not figured as being political, but rather an outside to the political, to law, and to state administrative justice. This is the realm of order, necessity, and violence. As Denise Ferreira da Silva's work shows us, modernity, far from seeing the minimization of nature, necessity, and violence, sees them as intrinsically linked to the rise of juridical and scientific reason. Quote, raciality produces both the subject of ethical life, who the halls of law and forces of the state protect, and the subjects of necessitas, the racial subaltern subjects, whose bodies and territories, the global present, have become places where the state deploys its forces of self-preservation, end quote. Her analysis of police killings ensures that these are not understood as a result of an exclusionary operation whereby those subject to police violence are excluded from the sphere of the universal, yet to be included via enfranchisement and rights. Rather, the very operations of scientific and juridical reason, ethical life, and so on, presuppose subjects of necessitas, for whom the full violence and self-preservation of the state is always already justified. She writes, the killing of Amadou Diallo in the South Bronx on February 4th, 1999, was not considered an act punishable by law, nor injurious to the public welfare. The 4 officers were acquitted of 2 charges of second-degree murder and 1 charge of reckless endangerment. No crime was said to have been committed because of the invocation of necessity and objectivity. The killing was not, Da Silva writes, a criminal act, but a legal, rational one. She continues, for this reason, when deployed in legal decisions, the racial laws of nature position the Black person in a moral region inhabited by subjects not governed by the rule of law, namely ineffectibility. Before and after the legal decisions, the shooting and the acquittal, the killing of Amadou Diallo would not constitute a crime because the scene of nature always already resolves it as a racial event, that is, as urban violence. While she is careful to distinguish this scene of nature from a Hobbesian state of nature, it is clear that the oppositional relation between nature and law works by figuring an outside to law that constantly and repetitively justifies and indeed naturalizes the use of violence as preservation. Describing a paramilitary police occupation of a favela in Brazil, supposedly a response to residents who were complaining of the difficulty of leaving their homes to be treated for dengue fever, Da Silva asks, if the police intervened to protect residents' access to citizenship, public health services, why does the choreography of the occupation only include visual and verbal signifiers of death? This question, as urgent now as it ever was, signals that the violence of self-preservation, natural order, and public health are of course not new, but we might add, have recently come under renewed intensity. The idea that there is a natural cause to herd immunity, articulated both more and less explicitly by the UK and US governments, has gone hand in hand with the argument that the protection of lives through interventionist public health measures is fundamentally at odds with the needs of the economy. We find here then the notion of natural order rearing its head to devastating effect. As Angela Metropoulos writes again, whether the right passes such deaths and illness as a result of the invisible hand of the market or God's divine will, either way, it is intent on describing them as inevitable and non-mournable. In other words, the natural order of households and markets, oikonomia, means the unequal distribution of death appears in front of the law, if it appears there at all, not as a crime, but as an inevitability. So to return to Hobbes for just a moment, it is of course no coincidence that in the frontispiece to the Leviathan, the only figures visible in the city are plague doctors and security guards. Policing and public health are not figured as being in tension, but as requiring one another. And this, I argue, calls into question the efforts of the, albeit very well-meaning, American Public Health Association, as well as a string of other medical associations in the US who have been seeking to define racist police violence in the US as a public health crisis. Against the backdrop of a wave of protests in the middle of the pandemic and the concomitant concerns about health implications, leading physicians and doctors associations sought to counter any criticism of the protests on health grounds that police violence is also a matter of urgent public health. The histories and philosophies of the state tell us that the health of the state is predicated on both natural and produced order. This process in itself is tied to oikonomic governance, an outside that is internal to the law, a scene of nature where anti-Black violence is configured as necessary for the health and preservation of the state. That is to say, public order, public health, and public safety are imbricated with one another conceptually and historically in ways that must be examined rather than wished away. Given the interplay of the law and its outside then, how the outside is immanent to the law, then the question of an anarchic outside to the outside of the law remains imperative. To try and untie the knotted apparatus of the law that in Foucault's words is, quote, the outside that envelops conduct, the darkness beyond its borders, the void that surrounds it, we might think of a politics of abolition as being out from the law's outside. If the state is always making, breaking, and suspending law, then the cycle of violence cannot be broken by, with, or through the law. As Jared Sexton writes, quote, a politics of abolition could never finally be a politics of resurgence, recovery, or recuperation. It could only ever begin with degeneration, decline, or dissolution. It is, he argues, a politics without claim, without demand, even, or a politics whose demand is too radical to be formulated in advance of its deeds. Not making claims or demands, but acting out from the law's outside in order to dissolve it, it is here that the thought of the anarchic outside that cannot be made to appear inside the law appears. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that absolutely wonderful paper, Melayna. Next, we have Laura Harris. We're very excited is joining us today. Laura Harris is Assistant Professor of Art and Public Policy and Cinema Studies at New York University. She's the author of the wonderful book, Experiments in Exile, C.L.R. James, Elio Oyitsika, and the Aesthetic Sociality of Blackness, out last year from Fordham University Press. And she's also published in Social Text, Women in Performance, Criticism, the South Atlantic Quarterly, and other journals. Welcome, Laura, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Well, that's been just a wonderful bunch of papers. I think I'm probably going to circle back to some of the questions Edgar raised at the very beginning, but address them in a different register. And this is also a work in progress that's in its really early stages. While doing research for my book on the Afro-Trinidadian writer C.L.R. James and the Brazilian artist Elio Oyitsika and their stays as undocumented immigrants in the US, I, along with some others, came across a bunch of videos made by French photographer Martine Barat with a camera provided by Félix Guattari of and with teenagers in the South Bronx in the 1970s. I have not made my way through all the tapes yet. There are, I think, like 100 hours. And this was the early days of video, when part of what it meant to use the medium was to not have to worry about how much time you tape. So there's a lot of footage and it is quite meandering. This is in part because they are all figuring out and negotiating what they want to do with this mechanism and how they want to do it. What becomes clear across the footage I have seen, however, which is often unfocused on every level, is the desire on the part of these teenagers to try to find ways to survive and thrive together, even as the state is working to tear everything they assemble apart. What, if anything, can we learn from these tapes? How might they inform the kinds of practices people have been describing and discussing for the past 2 days, the kind of gathering in the streets and beyond that has intensified in these last months? I have no interest in using these tapes as the basis for a sociological study of the Bronx in the 1970s, of these teenagers or of the gangs and other forms of association they engage in. And I have no interest in valorizing the way they lived in any simple way, as if it were an ideal model for self-organization, for a formation that would be an alternative to, say, the kind of political community Schmitt describes. What interests me about the tapes is the way these teenagers use them as an occasion for what Stefano Harney and Fred Moten refer to as study, and the way that reflects on and informs the forms of self-organization they are trying to pursue. Guattari offered the camera in the service of his own project of proving that other ways of life might be better than bourgeois European life. The photographer brings in the equipment and asks many leading questions herself, pressing the teenagers to look into the camera as they answer. Sometimes the teenagers answer these questions, sometimes they don't, and sometimes they ask questions themselves of one another, working through these questions in conversation and argument in order to find answers together. What these conversations and arguments suggest is that there is no stable or fixed way of life to discover here. These teenagers are, through these tapes, in the process of trying to figure out how to live, and they are thinking through it at every level. If in one tape they are reflecting on intimate relations and domestic arrangements, in the next they are reflecting on the friend-enemy divide as it plays out between warring gangs. And they are doing so in a zone that is being put under greater and greater pressure, where just surviving is difficult to ensure, where they are cast as the enemy of the broader political community of the US. Many of these teenagers are conscripted into the defense of this political community against enemies that would negate its way of life, as Schmitt puts it, and have gone off to fight in colonial wars in Vietnam, for example, and before that in Korea. Many are already veterans who talk about having completed one or more than one tour of duty. And several tapes contain recordings of occasions in which teenagers actually go to local military recruiting centers and confront the recruiters, demanding to know about what percentage of people they recruit are Black and brown and what their outcomes are. At the same time, these teenagers are cast as a threat to the political community and its way of life, as violent criminals, racialized nobodies, as Denise Ferreira da Silva has put it, whom the political community must defend itself against in a war that, as Dylan Rodriguez said the other day, is not a state of exception, but a grinding normal. Many of these teenagers refer to the South Bronx as Korea. They are the enemy within, but this is a complex within, for as many of the teenagers in the tapes note, they ended up in the Bronx in part because they or their parents were displaced from Puerto Rico, which the US colonized and depopulated by promoting migration and forced sterilization to break up the forms of life they found there. We might also understand these teenagers, if we think of them in the terms proposed by this panel, as cast in the role of hostile natives. This is already acknowledged perhaps in the popular film that framed this antagonism through the metaphor of the Fort Apache, the Bronx. But the surround can't be thought of as outside or beneath in any simple spatial sense. Whatever spatial certainty Schmitt's political community might presume in its investment in the bounded territory of the nation state, defending itself against outsiders or intruders, is, to say the least, complicated here. In the 1970s, New York City and the South Bronx in particular is in the process of being reclaimed for the citizenry through urban renewal projects, which were, as James Baldwin famously referred to them, Negro removal projects. This happened most notably in the Bronx, as whole sections of the borough were demolished to make way for an expressway to the white suburbs. At this moment, the Bronx is the scene of both ongoing regulation and ongoing destruction. That includes displacement, replacement of, for example, migrants or incarcerated people, or of children taken from one household and placed with another. It also includes the literal ripping up and burning down of the places where people gather and seek shelter, and the policing and disassembling of whatever formations emerge in the interstices, the spaces and spaces between that remain and are claimed by those who remain. What becomes evident over the course of these tapes is that in the face of the deliberate destruction of the physical and institutional infrastructures and the deliberate disassembly of households and other support structures, these teenagers, many of whom found themselves on their own on the streets, are actively inventing and reinventing their own ways to live. Often their survival depends on this. That doesn't mean the ways they invent are always ideal alternatives. They do seem to imbibe and reinstate friend-enemy distinctions, not just in their expansive understanding of the kinds of kinship and association that would bind a political community, but in their willingness to go to war against their declared enemies. That appears to be in part what drew the photographer, among others, to this scene. And that comes up again and again in the questions she puts to those who appear in the tapes. But again, the tapes are not wholly shaped by her questions. As I have noted, their answers and their rerouting of her questions suggest that they are still very much in the process of thinking through and working out these arrangements, critically reflecting on them, interested in new possibilities. They are not in open revolt. For the most part, they don't make demands of the state because the state doesn't have much they want. What they want is primarily from each other. Otherwise, they want to be left alone. These teenagers who seem mostly to be trying to evade eviction, to survive and to help their friends survive, throw open the question of how to live. They do not assume that the state has to collapse or become inoperative for them to do so. They neither change nor neutralize state law. They not only elude the law, but at the same time create their own internal laws and recreate them. They are not waiting for some moment of rupture. They are fully aware that they are under assault. They simply pursue this question anyway through study and practice. Indeed, these things are wholly combined, not just in those moments when they are talking about the reading and writing they do together, but in the discussions that emerge in the tapes. The tapes become an occasion for them not just to perform this life or to recount it by pointing the camera and narrating what they record for some anticipated outside audience, but also to reflect on and talk amongst themselves about how they would like it to be. The taping prompts and preserves their study, which is a fundamental element of their shared experiments. The fact that the tapes also mark the death of so many of those who are in this mix and the presence of so many babies lends an additional urgency to the recording process. The tapes become a way to honor the dead and preserve and pass on their contribution to these ongoing deliberations. Again, none of what they describe is offered as an ideal, and at no point do they hearken back to some lost ideal. They do occasionally recall some arrangements that they loved, friendships, study groups, or households, for example, but more often they discuss things that don't quite feel right. Their efforts do not proceed linearly or at all smoothly or even non-violently. They often hurt each other in many different ways as they seek and try out other arrangements, other ways to sustain one another in the interstices of the polis, which they inhabit and make use of as their experimental field. As the state cuts through streets and through buildings that people are still living in, they cut their own grooves. They cut to make room for themselves in the basements of locked but unoccupied buildings, to damage and render spaces non-valuable and non-saleable. And if we extend the idea of cutting beyond the scope of these tapes and think of the birth of hip hop to open up other kinds of sounds and intertwined with that, other ways to gather and move together. They are aware that they are under assault, that their status as enemies of the political community is due in part to their experimentation, to the irregularity, to borrow a term Fred Moten offered yesterday, of their arrangements. If we are here these few days to discuss the undercommons and destituent power, which of these proposals might help us understand what is happening in these videos? If the difference is, as we discussed yesterday, a matter of temporality, of defending how people already live versus anticipating the rupture, which would open the way for some wholly new way to live, the practice these tapes document might fall somewhere in between, though I don't know if that adequately characterizes the complexity of either approach, so I don't know if that opposition necessarily holds, I will add. But the resistance that is prior, due to the deliberate efforts of the state, is in disarray in this scene. Many of these young people are living in the streets again, as I said, alone until they find each other. For many of these teenagers, it can be hard to recall some satisfactory prior arrangements. But again, there is no expectation of a destituent or destituting moment that would clear the way for the coming politics, some wholly new, unprecedented thing. An old text, Maria Lugones's Tactical Strategies of the Streetwalker, has been on my mind as I watch these tapes. So I'm going to offer that as another resource for our conversation. Lugones's account of the hangout as a sustaining formation seems potentially helpful here. The hangout, as Lugones describes it, takes shape neither in private domestic space nor public, political, or institutional space, but in the streets that run between them. It is an unsettled, unenclosed, permeable, and fluid and mobile formation. No eye can be distinctly parsed out, no individualistic perspective, not even any standpoint can be claimed. Just the company of those also marked as she puts it, unacceptable or beneath respect. It is the site of ongoing study, the line of vision it affords, and by extension, the modes of analysis that line of vision enables are not from above or outside, but street level, shared among viewers with ill-defined edges. Made as the camera is passed back and forth and grabbed from friends' hands, narrated by a chorus of often competing and conflicting voices who don't always appear on screen, sometimes quite pointedly. These many hours of videotapes put us right in the middle of that line of vision, as well as the cautious tenderness and the opening to rereading sense and being reread in turn that Lugones insists the hangout fosters. While Barat, backed by Guattari, initiates this videography project, it is not entirely clear that either maintains control. There are certainly moments, including some very uncomfortable moments, when we can feel the desires that they bring to the project and have to confront our own if we are not to simply to discard these tapes and act as if they never happened. But it is also clear that these teenagers are using the device and the occasion for their own purposes and are willing to put up with a certain amount of crap to do that. They could not wait for a moment in which they could assume pure or sole sovereign authorship of the video as a means for expressing their point or points of view, any more than they could wait to find a way to build a life together. The footage reads like a messy, sometimes even uncomfortable layering of these things. But if we understand the hangout as a fluid formation, we might perhaps think of this project as still in medias res, continuing as we figure out how to carry these experiments and the thinking that went with them forward, and how to understand our own various and scattered experiments as not wholly separate from, but bound up with and accompanying theirs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful, and I think tied a lot of the panels together in a way that was really beautiful with this really profound example of the teens living in the South Bronx. As Fred Moten and Stefano Harney have said in various ways and at various points, insurgency comes first. I take this to mean that what Gershom Scholem once referred to as life's anarchic promiscuity, its irreducibly social, indeterminate, and non-sovereign character, precedes all attempts to capture and regulate life. But the errant and wayward character of life means that by living, we're constantly placed in a field of antagonism that, following Brian's paper, we can recognize as counterinsurgency, an ongoing attempt to separate living from its form, life from its conditions, to destroy the infrastructures of social reproduction where forces accumulate. And so across our panels, we see sort of a theme emerging of whether it's survival, the jurisgenerative outside of blackness, the hangout and constant experimentation of these teens in the South Bronx, and the sort of mobilization of this concept of the infrastructures of provisional infrastructures of social reproduction. We see this sort of emerging notion of that to affirm a communist forms of life are errant modes of being together that are always in the making, is a way of thinking about the hostility of the time. And I think that while there was sort of some pushback about destitution, I was thinking about something Rodrigo Carmi said on the first day of this conference, which is that destitution is not destruction, it is to give a new possibility to the world. While destruction is the violence of the revolutionary vanguard, destitution is the potentiality of whatever bodies render inoperable the power of this world. So there's some way that I think that the foregrounding of the modes of being together that sort of exceed and are constantly the site of counterinsurgency really highlight some of the themes of this conference. I want to open it up to questions from people, so please throw your questions into the question and answer, and we can actually elevate you to a participant in the video chat. And on Stack, we already have one person, Gerardo Munoz, who wants to ask a question. So I'm going to hand it over to Gerardo if he's ready to ask his question of the panelists, and we can hopefully open up the discussion. Although that might take a moment because I just threw that out there without giving Rose a chance to be prepared to do this. So while that technical magic is in the making, another sort of theme that emerged sort of continually was this notion of which Eduardo Ia said, disorder as the imminent order of things. We see that in his paper, but also in the idea of the strategy of counterinsurgency as ongoing destabilization, the sort of anomic nature of law that Melayna pointed to, and obviously this place of the outside or the surround that these teenagers in the South Bronx were living in. One question I have maybe for Brian is that, for Brian, you notice that this form of this type of disorder is a sort of strategic function of counterinsurgency rather than a breakdown of state sovereignty. And so I think there might be a slight tension between your articulation of counterinsurgency as sort of a unified strategy and Edgar's conception. So before we go to Gerardo, maybe Brian, if you want to respond to this sort of question of the strategic role of disorder.
Hey, y'all. Can you see me okay? I'm here.
Yes, we can see you.
Oh, okay, sorry. Thank you. People are like, it's weird not to be talking to an audience, and they were right. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, I could take your question and try and reformulate it in another way that might link back to some of the other panels, and then also, yeah, I mean, the way that I would talk about that is, I think that yeah, I think there's kind of two emerging ways right now of thinking about what we're living through, right? And one of those ways is kind of what I usually shorthand as the breakdown argument, or there are arguments that think that sometime after World War II, there was an age in which certain kinds of conditions like were met, you know, and this can be, there's lots of different versions of these breakdown arguments, you know, like, so there was a monopoly on violence, you know, capitalism produced certain kinds of wealth that was shared, or there were certain kind of juridical norms that were met. And that's kind of, you know, one version. In that version, what is happening now is like a breakdown of these former structures that were once stable, right? The other version of the argument, or the other version of trying to explain, at least for me, like why things are the way they are right now, is rather one that, and this is also an argument that, I mean, there's lots of people make this argument, but Daniel Nimser is somebody who I think of as also making this argument, is that, in fact, the post-war, you know, there's two different ways of doing it. So there's one way that's like the post-war period was an exception. And in fact, like the kinds of violence and the kinds of forms of governance that exist right now have a lot more in continuity. They have a lot more to do with the late 19th century, and that this post-war period was actually an exception historically. There's another version of this, what I call the continuity argument, I guess. There's another version of it that's actually kind of the argument that I'm trying to make, which is that I think it's really easy to poke holes. I mean, it's pretty easy to poke holes in some of the ways that people talk about the post-war period as being, producing certain kinds of norms that were met, like accumulation was not shared among people. Violence was directed against all kinds of communities, even in the heart of, like the social successful, in quotes, like capitalist order. So my version of it is there's just a continuity of these different forms of what we might today use the language of paramilitary violence, right? But we can just think of as being these forms of kind of state and capital violence have always been necessary. And that what we're really living, and that's kind of why I try and make the counterinsurgency argument, is because, like it starts in the heart of the post-war period, right? I think it really pokes a hole in the kind of like Gali type of argument, that it's globalization that those things like arise. But that's kind of how I see the field of those discussions. And I mean, obviously people can have differences. Another way, I'm sorry if, I don't know, hopefully this will be helpful for like opening discussion. I'm sorry taking up so much space, but another version of that is kind of like the ideas about biopolitics, and that was something I was also trying to foreground with destabilization, is like, there is an idea of biopolitics that's like, it successfully administers like a social order. And that again is like kind of coming out of kind of a tradition of seeing that there was a prior historical moment, and maybe that's just European social theory. Like maybe it is descriptive of something that happened in Europe. I'm not going to take a stand on that, but like, so biopolitics also the way that kind of functions. But yeah, and the other thing I would just throw out there is like, I think the name of this panel is something about like defending the fort, right? Which in of itself is like referencing counterinsurgent, like a form of like prior colonial, what we think of as counterinsurgency violence. So I think that the name of the panel is a continuity, it's like pointing towards that, that felt sense of continuity, right? And so I'm curious, I'm interested, and like Laura pointed out, like Puerto Ricans in the Bronx, Fort Apache, right? There's another reference back to that prior history of paramilitary counterinsurgent, violence, like against people in specific communities, in the way it's reworked in the present, So I think that field of violence and how do we think about social violence is like a really rich one, and I would love to, open the conversation there. I think, it's a great gesture.
Yeah, thank you. I think that sort of opens a conversation, which I think several of the other panelists could respond to, but maybe especially Edgar, since you were thinking specifically through this sort of what I think he sort of what Brian sort of puts as a breakdown argument, what your response would be.
Yes, my response would be, well, first would be another, I mean, what Brian is doing is, I can fully agree with what he's proposing, but because, but then my further question would be, well, you're saying that we have an exception in the post-war period, what we could call the exception of the welfare state, if that's the possibility of, or the exception of the moment in which it seems that all the social antagonisms can somehow be absorbed and neutralized and somehow resolved within this arrangement between democracy and capitalism, and ultimately that culminates with the end of history and so on. So you would claim, well, this is an exception. Then I would say, well, why do we have this exception to begin with? Why did this exception appear? I mean, why didn't we continue with the same, colonial, open violence that we've seen before and after? So that would be perhaps the first answer. Then the second one is, I think you're right that the colonial genealogy or the colonial experience has become a lot more relevant to understand our situation now than maybe the question of biopolitics and ultimately the Holocaust. I think this is this is basically Achille Mbembe's argument, right? Instead of the concentration camp that Agamben proposes as the paradigmatic nomos of the modern, that is the concentration camp where biopolitics develops itself towards its paroxysmal development or something. Instead of that, we have the plan, the colonial plan and situation that actually describes much better what he calls not the biopolitics but the necropolitics of the modern. So I think that then your argument, I don't know, it seems to me that it has more to do with this question of the necropolitical and the colonial genealogy. Finally, the last thing would be, I think I didn't express myself well when I said I don't want to convey the idea that my theorization of survival is just a theorization of a breakdown, a theorization of the collapse of modernity. It's rather it's precisely because I think that this is the maybe Agamben's position, and I think that the position of destituent power or even bare life, and I think my impulse is precisely to see, well, modernity has collapsed for sure. Now we have globalization, and that's how the breakdown itself is the new productive system. Destruction is productive and constructive and so on. So there's nothing. It's nothing melancholic, let's say, about this, right? It's not like we had a moment of stability and now we no longer have a nomos. So no melancholy, no nostalgia here. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you. Do any of the other two panelists want to chime in on this question? Okay, well, I'm going to pass it over to Gerardo to ask his question live, and we'll experiment with this dropping in feature.
Okay, does it work? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. It was an important panel, I thought, and I learned a lot. I thought that an important center here of discussion was precisely this integration of sovereignty and something like an interregnum opening, right, of our epoch. And I was wondering, my question is more for Edgar, but perhaps for the whole panel, which, if this is the case, right, if we are seeing what Gali in the wake of the millennium called Guerra Globale, and interesting enough, Gali in recent years has now made a different turn. He has become a sovereignist in Italy, interesting enough, which I think is, as the Invisible Committee would say, is a last desperate attempt to hold on into something like factical politics in the wake of the interregnum. So if we are in this condition, right, of the destabilization of sovereignty and the modern architectonic of politics, as Gali calls it, I wonder if perhaps another way in which we can think about the destituent gesture is to renounce any sort of compensatory sovereign politics, and if that's the case, then I would be skeptical, for instance, to have the Catalan independence movement, right, as an example of destituent power. It would be the opposite, no? It would be a completely constituent sort of late attempt, right? Desperate attempt to claim sovereignty, right? And so more or less, that's what I wanted to say. If we agree that, that sovereignty is precisely what opens up the destituent as against constituents.
Somebody else wants to reply, or I can say something. Or...
Maybe I think Laura mentioned in her presentation the sort of another sort of sense of the limits of destituency to talk about what these teenagers were doing that I think like connects to this, whether destituent power is always framed in relation to sort of a sovereign or constituent horizon, or whether there's some sort of like activity of life on the outside. I don't know if that is a nice connection.
Well, I would agree with Gerardo in the sense that it's, you know, I mean, Agamben announces in some places a coming politics. So it would be perhaps a reiteration of sovereignty under different terms. What would that be? I tend to agree with you. What else could there be other than that? And that's perhaps I spend my time more studying the alternative kind of formations that grow within the confines of these forms of power that you all have been describing, and are trying to forge other ways of living anyways, perhaps just within the, I guess you could say, the interstices or even the husk of this other thing. I wouldn't, you know, how else might we imagine a form of social life or a form of, I mean, the term Schmitt uses is political community. I think Marquise Bay was saying yesterday, not community, but coalition, whatever term we might imagine. How else can we imagine our social arrangements other than being defined in other terms? Is my contribution to that would be, but Edgar and Brian and Melayna can speak more to, you know, thinking it through the tradition of thinking about states. I guess I'm understanding my contribution to be what other traditions do we have of theorizing this in another register?
Yeah, I don't know. If I can just jump in and say something real quick, like Laura, like something I really appreciated about, I mean, I was gonna kind of prompt and say like, is there, you know, what do we, right? Because I did note, obviously there's the difference between these kinds of, mine is a little bit more maybe historically informed, but there is still this kind of like theoretical, you know, like it's trying to engage with certain kinds of terms or whatever, you know, but like ethnography, like what do we gain, you know, like, and I really appreciated that. And I kind of felt like what I was trying to kind of like, you know, what do we gain from taking this very deeply? I guess I was trying to kind of position myself with you as like being on the side of material, but, you know, like, I don't know if that was successful or not, you know, but like, you know, going deeply into these histories, into this kind of like, you know, archive. And one of the things that I thought like, is like, there was a moment where you said, you were quoting Dylan Rodriguez and you said, not the exception, but the grinding normal. And at least that really resonated with me. And I thought like, oh, I felt like that was like a moment of like something in common, like where I'm like, yeah, it's not, I don't feel like it's exceptional. I feel like it is a grinding normal. And I think that is kind of, for me, at least, a lesson of counterinsurgency. But, you know, I was also kind of wanting to ask a question to, you know, to bring Melayna a little bit, like I was saying counterinsurgency, and it kind of felt like Melayna was like going all the way back to Aristotle, you know, in like the household, to think that outside, we're all trying to think the outside of the outside in some ways. And I think that's a beautiful formulation that, you know, is really lovely. And so I, you know, just trying to piece together all those different genealogies, like what do we get from coming at it from maybe from a ethnographic or from a deep description perspective. I don't know if you identify that way. And then, you know, Melayna just kind of, or Melayna, like, you know, like, did you feel kind of like, what was your feeling of like all these different, you know, do you feel like your genealogy of the idea of that outside of the outside is coming from like a different place? Like those were things I was super curious. And then maybe we can kind of try and loop in like Gerardo's like question there too, you know, like, I don't know, those were just moments that really resonated with me.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I think what's interesting, and I think this was mentioned yesterday as well, is the kind of the things that Agamben doesn't engage with are really important and really telling of his theory. And certainly what I understand by destituent power and what he's trying to do is to think of an outside to the outside, right? He's trying to think of ways that we can deactivate sovereign power and the kind of legal apparatus that supports it. And yeah, so he doesn't think through concrete examples maybe, but stays at quite a high level of abstraction. But he certainly wants to try and get away from sovereign power, right? Or to think outside of sovereign power. And I think that's, you know, a failure of his to engage the Black radical tradition in that sense is really, really strong and telling in his theory, because there's a whole tradition, of course, that we know that does think the outside of sovereign power and outside of the law in ways that isn't, you know, necessarily this kind of like revolutionary trying to take hold of the state and trying to form a new law or a new state, but is actually exists outside of that, and he just doesn't engage with that tradition at all. So yeah, I guess, you know, what we're all trying to do here is to think with those traditions and with those archives that he leaves out in order to think an emancipatory politics.
Sorry, one sec. What is it? Okay, I'm about to speak though. What was I going to add to that? What I do think are interesting moments in Agamben is when he talks about the feast or the poem, for example, where he does try to offer some grounding. It's at such a small scale, it feels like there's a disconnect between that and the other things he's talking about. But I do feel like he's searching for places where he could mark this other, a veering away. That's one thing I would say. And then the other thing I would say is, I mean, another resource that I think Nicole brought up in a conversation elsewhere might be The Order of Things by Cedric Robinson, where he revisits the question of politics without any presumptions and looks to other things that might rhyme with, we could say, a political formation as we know it, to try to see if there are other principles that we could bring to bear, even in our thinking about it, and the way that defines or delimits our sense of possibility within it. You'll have to excuse me for just a second while my family
I have a question from Kieran Ahrens, who's going to ask it, but he says it's related to this. So hopefully his video's up and he can ask.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks to all the, can you hear me, Sam?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for all the panelists for this really stimulating conversation. I guess I want to maybe present a different reading of the one that people are giving of Agamben, and maybe also push against the framing of what we should be looking for when we think about destitution. And I think there's a problem when we think about sovereignty entirely in terms of structures of the state or vertical forms of domination. I think that's certainly part of the story, and it's an important one. But I think we would be remiss if we didn't remember that wrapped up in the problem of destitution is also a search for an ethics. And in that sense, sovereignty represents not simply an instance of invasion or encroachment or coercion or colonization that steps from the outside and takes over bodies and crushes life forms. It also is one that peels them apart from themselves. And I think there's an entire reflection in Agamben's work, particularly starting in with The Time That Remains, and that extends into the use of bodies most profoundly, on the forms of separation that pull us outside of ourselves, to be blunt. So the idea here would be that, without discrediting any of the other framings of sovereignty, I think that there's an effort to think not an outside of the outside, but actually to think about all the ways in which we're pulled outside of ourselves and forced into obsessive relationships with a series of problems that are not actually the ones we should be thinking about. So, worrying too much about whether that be the experience of managing the entire world, or planning or policy, as Fred and Stefano have thought about it, approaching things from a bird's eye view, the way that the Lugones text begins that was just mentioned, right? Rather than thinking from within sensible worlds about the experiences that people have, which often are in dislocation from those kinds of, just to be, the managerial vocations is the way Agamben will talk about it. And so I think that the theory of use is very much an effort to think a restoration of contact with the world, a restoration of sensibility in the way that Rodrigo was asking us to think on the first day as well, right? Of the imagination as a sort of potentiality within life. And I don't think that's about looking for enclaves or pure examples of life without unimpacted by the state, right? I think it's precisely the opposite, if anything. I think, just as a last point in this regard, the example of festivity that was just raised is an important one. The feast, the festival, the theme of these moments of exceptional overturning and so on. I think if you follow this theory backwards, and I've done a bit of this work, you find one of the most profound reflections in Agamben's work. It's actually a conversation that he's having with the ultra left in Italy. One of the proxies for that is Furio Iesi, whose name has come up several times. And I think there, one of the things he's worrying a lot about is that the name for festivity in the 20th century revolutionary tradition is precisely revolt. And the limits of revolt, as Iesi talked about in Spartacus, are precisely the same limits as those of the festival, except for the premises become ever more negative and ever less, so to speak, indigenous to the people living through them, right? And so I think we've seen the limits of both the power and the limits of the festival this summer in the US. At least anyone who knew to look saw what festivity can mean. But I think also I think there's an effort to think, starting with the time that remains, a different mode and a different temporality of resistance that moves into the world, not into a subject, but into the world. And I think this would be the topic of the panel tomorrow. So I invite you all to check that out as well. But yeah, just maybe instead of focusing only on the neglect of the Black radical tradition, I thought maybe also, which is a fine point to raise, but I think there's also something that's challenging from within the European tradition as well on this point that we should take seriously, I guess.
Yeah, maybe I completely agree with what Kieran was saying about the use of Agamben in this respect, and virtually every thinker. I mean, you can say the same about everybody. I mean, no matter how distant or dissimilar, there's always that that complexity that just makes it so useful. But maybe my problem would be that with the Destituent power specifically, is that he's somehow responding to a form of a state power that my sense is that it's no longer here. It's no longer dominant. And perhaps, I don't know, this may be a cheap trick, but the way he has responded to the pandemic, I don't know if you are aware. Agamben says, "Well, this is all. It's all. It's pure. It's a state fantasy that they're. It's pure biopolitics. The state has invented this pandemic so that they can control our life and so on and so forth." So he's virtually saying, he's taking. I don't know, like Trump's position in this country, right? So I think in that moment, it's when you realize that the state that he's trying to destitute is no longer is a ghost, or is something of the past, and then in that respect, the ethical impulse that I think that his philosophy undeniably contains and pursues becomes deactivated because the reality has changed. yeah, that would be perhaps my critique. That it's not so much the critique of, oh, well, he has neglected black radicalism or non-European examples, which is true, but rather that the enemy that he's fighting, which for me it's the totalitarian state, the total state of the 20th century, is no longer the way the state unfolds in the 21st century. Right? So.
I got a question I would like to ask, since we're kind of talking about this. Laura mentioned like the conversation yesterday and thinking about destituent as the difference in between destituent and undercommons as temporal, defending how people already live versus like a rupture of the new. And I guess just to throw this out, like Melayna, or let me just say that the distinction, and then I'll kind of maybe throw it out. Like I'm destituent. Sometimes it's like, I'm like, is there space to think about capitalism from within destituent power? Like it seems so very focused upon the state. And one of the things I appreciate about the undercommons, at least for me, it's very close to, it feels like it gets us close to a term, obviously, that I like a lot, which is social reproduction, that I think is important, you know, which is both how to kind of produce a kind of coherence. Like I think in moments of destabilization, like we're learning, part of what we're trying to learn is like how to produce a coherence that isn't, that doesn't contain forms of domination, but also that contains a form of like, you know, economics within it that maybe isn't the oikos. You know, so it gets us kind of doing both things, both functions differently of what we think of as the state and capital. And Melayna, like one of the things I was thinking listening to your talk was like, I was kind of like, is one of the arguments maybe that like there was so much new there, it was difficult, you know, I was trying to kind of follow everything, is like the oikos is the site of kind of like authoritarianism, but also a form of kind of like capitalist production, perhaps. I wasn't exactly sure, and I was kind of like, oh, well, that's a really nice gesture. Anyway, so just to throw that open, like for me, one of the differences I hear in between those terms is like destituent. I'm not sure about, can we talk about how capital orders or disorders, and undercommon seems to give us a little bit closer to being able to do both at once. But I'm, you know, would love to hear more about any of that from anyone out there.
Could you just repeat the last part of what you said? Sorry, Brian.
I just said I would love to hear more from anyone.
Yeah, before.
But if you want to say something, like, was I understanding your argument correctly that it's both the side of authoritarianism and also kind of like the beginnings of kind of like a capitalist social form, perhaps? Like, I wasn't sure if you were trying to get both of those within the idea of like the oikos. Hopefully I'm using the term that you were using. If not, please correct me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and the reason for bringing that in is it comes, to give a bit of context, it comes from the work that I did for my PhD, which was kind of, it was a philosophical history of police. So I was trying to understand how philosophers have kind of articulated police power across kind of different eras and different kinds of philosophies. But essentially, I was really struck by this book by Marcus Dubber called The Police Power and Patriarchy, I think it's called. And he talks about oikonomia, police power, as deriving not from what its kind of etymological clue would give us, which is from the polis and the politia, but rather from its opposite, which is oikonomia, this kind of managerial household form of governance that, as I said, is not, doesn't reference laws or justice, but is rather a form of governance that is praxeological, non-epistemic, and concerned with activity, rather than rules. And it's through this form of oikonomic governance that a kind of a supposedly non-political, which is of course political, realm that's concerned with order, that's concerned with, you know, doing what's necessary in order for there to be order. That's where this comes to the fore. So oikonomia, I was kind of tracing this idea of oikonomia through through this idea of police power, and like I said, you know, there's a moment in which kind of in the history of ideas, in the history of political economy, economists say, well, you know, this notion gets displaced, or it gets replaced, or it disappears, essentially, with the rise of liberalism and political economy. And my point is to say it's still there, that this oikonomic mode of governance underpins liberal forms of governing, but also, you know, more authoritarian ones as well, and that it's there across both, and that's something that Angela Mitropoulos, who I was quoting in the paper as well, that's something that she talks about really interestingly in relation to the pandemic, and the way in which the household has become this crucial site during the pandemic, right? Because we've been confined to them, and they are these sites of reproduction. And she talks about the ways in which the household, the kind of unequal distribution of violence operates through households, and the way in which that unequal distribution is naturalized via these households, if that makes sense. I hope so.
I have a couple of questions from the chat from people who can't say them. So I'm going to just read like 2 or 3 and see if we can get a couple of responses. So there's 2 questions from Ursula. She asks, hello, thank you all for presenting. Perhaps panelists can comment on the oikos and squatted housing. I have a particular interest in Catalonia and the context there around squats. And then a little bit later, she asks again, I'm interested to learn thoughts on how the so-called housing crisis and how it affects revolt in general. So this question of oikonomia, not just as a site of regulation, but as a site that's like highly politicized or maybe not politicized, but a central site of struggles for social reproduction, and how we resist this enclosure there. A second question from Brady, it's kind of a longer one. As Laura Harris noted, one of the tensions and areas of study throughout this conference has been the question of temporality, as well as the juxtaposition of the event of the pandemic and uprising within a longer trajectory of survival as subversion. Blackness, so much as it exists outside of the outside, poses an ongoing crisis to racialized capitalism. Crisis seems central to this conversation. Brian Whitner's work in crisis cultures, after all, focuses on bounded but long-lasting financial crises and the architecture produced by finance to recompose capitalist accumulation. How do we understand Blackness and survival during crises that are more or less bounded in time, more or less chronological? To what extent do the crises of capitalism produce auto-destituent potentialities? Does building undercommons, hangouts, organizing social reproduction, and so on prepare us to collectively seize the moments of crisis that capitalism inevitably presents? Do those events contain disproportional potential for change? So I'm going to throw those 2 questions out.
Well, maybe I'll answer to the first one about Catalonia, or about economy and housing. Well, this is you see, this is another fascinating moment in which you don't know what the progressive position is, because as Ursula is saying, there's a long tradition of a squatting in Catalonia, and anarchism for that matter. There's the explanation that, you know, Catalonia, Barcelona especially, is a highly industrialized city throughout the 19th century, 20th century, with, you know, lots of class struggle, and yet instead of communism or socialism, the major political affiliation of most workers is anarchism, and the reason is because they are distant from state power, which is in Madrid, in the center of the peninsula, so that creates some sort of I wouldn't say a utopia, but some investment in anarchism that wants to refuse both a capital and a state power. And I think that the very widespread practices of squatting emerged from that, from these total denial of both private property, but police power, state power, and everything. But now this is when things get interesting. Now there's another in political investment in Barcelona, which is that no, we need private property, and we need to be protective of our houses, and there's a politicization of the house, because everything else, all the public space, has been conquered by the Spanish state. So that is the moment in which you can propose resistance and virtually articulate something in civil society. So you see, there's this okay, so what should we do? Should we endorse private property, or should we try to destroy both capital and all forms of power, individual and collective and official? So this is another conundrum of this that make somehow impossible to determine this is the clear progressive position and this is the reactionary one. So it's one of those situations.
I mean, I would only add that, what these teenagers are doing is, you could call it squatting. Why not? And by calling it squatting, you are drawing links between what they're doing and what other people are doing all over the place, and have been doing for years and years. I think a lot of the emphasis yesterday was on the priorness of resistance, which yes, but also we have to keep our eye on the persistence of resistance and the recurrence of these kinds of experiments and the resonances between them. I mean, we might also at the same time think, in the 1970s, when these teenage women are rethinking questions of being a daughter, being a mother, being a wife, gang marriage, the terms of those things, what happens if we think that together with feminist white middle class feminist consciousness raising groups on the other side of the freeway? How can we think the persistent and connected threads across these things? So yes, these are squats, and to think those in relation to other squatting projects, from maroon projects, which you might conceive in such terms, through the kinds of things that you're talking about in Catalan, seems to me to be totally generative, not simply in order to universalize that activity, but to understand the connections and the enmeshment and the entanglement between doing it one place and doing it somewhere else. And then not separately from that, you can weave the things that structure the spaces into which squatting becomes necessary and valuable. What is the difference, or not difference, but what's the relationship between a squat in the Bronx and a squat in Puerto Rico, for example? How then do you begin to think the interrelatedness of those things? What's the interrelatedness, or how do we think together marriage in a gang squat and marriage as it plays out in a suburban home? That's not an example of a squat, but how do we? There's a resistance to that the feminist movement articulates that might be well thought in relation to, again, not collapsed, not into some universalized experience of that, but into a reopening of the questions of how that is structured and how that is differentially structured. And what are the other ideas and practices that people have invented, and that's when you think the temporality question that you raised, have always been, might be a better way to be thinking about it, have always been thinking against the grain of the mandates of the state, in this case that is subjecting people constantly to eviction, and that is, through child services, constantly disassembling the formations that, and through the police that put people in jail, disassembling the kinds of kinship or informal formations that emerge.
I want to just quickly invite Brady to come up to sort of restate or reframe, since we can experience this possibility of other people jumping in.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brady. One of the things that I've been really interested in this question of temporality, and I think, Brian, your work really expands on that in crisis cultures in terms of especially like financial crises. But also, if we're thinking in terms of the undercommons, it seems like part of what's at stake is that there is, a sort of perpetual crisis posed to racialized capitalism by Blackness and by Blackness in the undercommons in particular. And so I'm wondering, as we're thinking through sort of this, really long time period in which we can situate just day-to-day life in the undercommons as being subversive, as opening other potentialities, but we also have these flare-ups of crises that capitalism produces, or that show, parts of this long durée of a crisis sort of laid bare. How do we relate to those in terms of weighting different moments as having a unique opportunity to open new possibilities, to challenge capitalism, and how do we understand the sort of like potentialities of those moments, either differently or sort of in the same register? Does that make sense?
I mean, I have just a very basic point to make, which is, building on Brian's points about social reproduction, there's basic subsistence at the economic level, but there's also social reproduction that we all engage in that's neither economic nor even biological, but in the terms of the sharing of ideas, that are often the target of violence as well, right? When you crush a group, you also shut down whatever records of it might persist. So by sharing information, in some ways we are reproducing these ideas and reproducing these projects and joining differentially in them.
Yeah, I guess I could just say that I wasn't sure if that was a question about like, do we have to wait for the event to emerge? Or can actions like kind of precipitate the event or not? Sometimes I feel like maybe that question is becoming less, that particular version of the question, like the crises this is kind of what I heard in your question, is like the crises are just coming, and so it's more a question of like how to act within those multiple crises. But I think to say the word temporality, like I would love to spend some more time there and think about that word and think through it. I think there is a way in which the idea of social reproduction, the connection in between social reproduction and like revolt or insurgency or political practice, however you want to describe it, like one of the great points on that transmission belt in the United States is like through the Black Panthers. And that's like a tradition, that's like worth dwelling. That's I want to say history, or perhaps a temporality that's like worth dwelling with and thinking about the erasure there. It's less so now in the academic world. People study those social, those programs of social reproduction, like the food programs and the ambulances and the sickle cell clinic and things like that. But maybe in more kind of, political spaces, perhaps that legacy perhaps maybe isn't quite, that the temporality of that legacy and heritage is maybe slightly different. And just to throw out like two other kind of points within a kind of like, spatial temporal frame, places where people have thought together, like those questions of social reproduction and some kind of emancipatory politics, is like in the PKK. They did make a transition from being like an old school kind of guerrilla movement to something different, in the 90s. And also the Zapatistas went through a very similar transformation, right, where they realized like and in some ways, like, I don't know if I can make this argument, but like, I think that part of that transformation was one, like getting pulled onto the train of counterinsurgency and realizing that, you know, there's a recent crime think piece that argues against kind of civil war language and argues that the, you know, insurrections have to be social. And I think there's a sense of like that, you know, I don't know if we can, if I can't make that argument, but I think there's a sense in which like getting pulled too much onto that terrain that's so favorable, like it was so unfavorable to them, they pulled back from that and moved into things like juntas de buen gobierno, you know, which is like much more focused on like social reproduction of like community, implies a bunch of other things. But so just to try and multiply a little bit some of those traditions that are out there and are kind of think about like the temporality of them, uneven temporality, they occur in the 90s or in the 60s and in different places or whatever, you know. And I think that that's like, I don't know, I feel like that part of what we're doing with the outside of the outside is like, for so long, democratization was like the framework, right? There can be no revolution, like there's only liberal democracy for many people, not for everyone, you know. But I think like recovering that like imaginative capacity is like part of what our conversation is today, right?
Yeah, maybe I also want to say something about temporality, the temporality of survival, if there's such a thing. But it seems to me that I mean, I keep going back to this possibility of distinguishing between modernity and globalization. But my sense is that in modernity, we clearly have what we could call the temporality of the new. So change, the event, and politics itself are embedded in the emergence of the new and somehow the overcoming of the old. I think in globalization and you know, survival could be part of this. The temporality is no longer revolves around the emergence of the new, but it's the temporality of the always already. So you're always already engaged in some process of change, of resistance, of survival, of attack and defense and so on. So but you see, so the emphasis here is that, well, it's no longer about, you know, waiting for an event or preparing, or you're always already reacting, right? So again, that's maybe another way of describing you know, the conditions for politics today.
I think, I mean, I'm curious about this sort of a sort of tension I see in the periodization of survival, either as like an ongoing continuous struggle of, you know, all people who've like faced the violence of colonization, a sort of like whatever, or an emergent sort of frame of emancipatory thought in the current moment. And I think you were sort of gesturing towards that, Brian, but in some ways, like maybe the way in which you're periodizing doesn't actually, there's not such a disagreement with you and Edgar insofar as there's something about, you know, the last 20, 30 years that take survival strategies that have been proliferating for a long time and have moved it to the center of emancipatory thought in some ways. So I'm curious about that. I'm going to throw in two other questions from the question and answer. So we've got some questions from Ricardo. And so he asks, how do regimes of survival and unstable conditions of social state violence and temporary forms of life echo zombie narratives, the pandemic of zombie states, zombie politics, zombie forces, and zombie economics? Existing outside of the outside of justifying the home space for totalized preservation that we are always already in, as in the Night of the Living Dead, defending the house, the fort, and the space. Also, how do post-biopolitics of everyday street between necropolitics and ways of counter modes of life, like the teenagers, the voting of the grandmother, and the questions of pleasure as with the liminal street life of errant forms and encounters by Samuel Delaney's thoughts on bodies and contact zones. So that's Ricardo's question. Then from Anonymous, we have, is it possible that there are potential pivots for destituent organizing even within movements that articulate a desire for sovereignty? What if this is the only shared language that people find in the breakdown and fragmentation of existing orders? So I'm going to throw those two questions out there.
I could just say real briefly on the periodization thing, like, yeah, I've been really interested that Lahuna and Dylan Rodriguez and also the Vitalists, and there's just so many echoes of counterinsurgency, you know, throughout this conference I like wasn't expecting, you know, and I find that to be really fascinating. And so I'm like trying to reflect on, you know, why that is, why that feels like language that people are moving towards. And I have my own particular reasons for that. But that is part of my argument is that insurgency is always assumed like there's an available surplus for social reproduction. And counterinsurgency has always attacked that. So for me, there is a kind of continuity, like over time, of like that back and forth, you know, cat and mouse kind of game in the present.
Yeah, maybe there's something about the first question about how the zombie narratives, it says, or how do regimes of survival echo zombie narratives, and I think that there's something very true here. I mean, these in between life and death that somehow we inhabit in many ways. This idea of that there's some that we live in this not so much in the end of times, but it's almost like a post-apocalyptic moment, or in other words, this idea that, well, our days are limited, you know, in terms of the climate crisis. That's very clear. Our days are limited, and we just need to you know, like try to you know, contain a catastrophe as much as possible. So it's not so much about, like, you know, what is to be done or how we can accelerate the you know, the development of capitalism so we reach communism. So that'll be the Marxist modern temporality, but rather how can we contain the catastrophe and then you know, somehow extend this life after death. And I think this reminds me of what Megan Moore was talking about the first day about the chronic, and I think Eric Castin has a book about this too, about how the temporality of the chronic would be this moment in which you're not dead. They don't let you, you know, doctors don't let you die, but you're not fully cured either, you know. So you inhabit this, yeah, zombie or chronic or in between temporality, which is, well, in from a modern perspective, you could say it's a you know, totally anti-revolutionary temporality. You say, well, there's no, you cannot you know, end this process. It will always be with you. And but which may be true. It may not be revolutionary in the same way. And yet I think that Megan was clearly, you know, articulating that for us. It's still political. You can still engage politically in that. Even if you're in a chronic or in a zombie-like zone, right?
I'm not sure if this is going to directly answer your question, Ricardo, but you're right. I mean, and Melayna's been talking about this the whole time. The home is not some sort of sacred space outside of violence in any way. If I'm remembering correctly, in Night of the Living Dead, once the guy leaves the house, he's killed by the police. So you know, neither in nor out is a safe space. But I think if I've emphasized the household formation in my piece, it's maybe just because that's what's on my brain, because I'm teaching a feminist practices class. But Lugones is interested in the street, and the starting point for her essay is almost this very long footnote she gives, where she says, I was thinking through this as I myself was tending my wounds as a victim of domestic violence, in conversation with someone who worked in her housekeeper, I think, who worked in other people's homes. So it was a workplace for her, and who was also a prostitute. So she's saying, the two of us found we felt safer in some ways on the street than we did in homes or other people's homes, where whoever was the owner of the home. So she's very much arguing for the street as a place that would be neither enfolded into institutions and institutional logics, nor accepting of the home as somehow outside of that sort of, she sees the home as on a continuum with prison, the mental hospital, the, et cetera. She just lays out a whole sort of trajectory in which she feels like home is just one on a chain. So I would not absolutely valorize the home, but I'm interested in the ways that these teenagers are sort of critically thinking about that, based on their own experience of, good, bad, and ugly in various homes, and in the sense that they need a place to crash. So that's part of my thinking. And in terms of Delaney, the stuff that Delaney's talking about in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, I think that he is absolutely also interested in these, in the same kind of thing, very similar to Lugoni's. Most of it happens in an actual movie theater. So it's not always in the streets. So there's a kind of it's these mobile formations. I mean, it happens in the theater, but then it also trails out in the kind of conversations that might continue, or the chance meetings that happen outside. There's no, moving against the grain of Schmitt's notion that a political community requires a territory, and also against the grain that I think that you brought up early on, its aterritoriality doesn't make it necessarily any, instantly better. How can we not require a rigid idea of a spatial formation that would be the right one? Does that make any sense? And I don't know if that answers your question or not, Ricardo, but it seems that part of the practice of squatting, going back to Ursula's question, is a rethinking of what shelter might require, of how one might organize it. Even in some of the tapes, you see people sharing space, but also sharing space temporally, as they did in the Harlem Renaissance, where people took shifts. What are the various ways that one might inhabit a space that as an open question, rather than as a presumed good that the home as safe space seems to imply.
I'm wondering if Melayna can also jump in on this zombie question, because I think there's something about the figure of the zombie as that which falls outside of the human, and the sort of fear of contagion that brings together the intersection between public health and anti-Blackness that I thought was really exciting in your presentation.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can speak to zombie films particularly. I'm not a film buff at all, but I think I know what the questioner and what you're getting at there. And I think, yeah, there's been a striking kind of response to the government response to the pandemic, and I think it's happened across both the UK and the US, whereby there's been a lot of legal commentators and human rights groups saying that the problem with the government response to the pandemic is that it's being policed as a public order matter rather than a public health matter. And what was striking to me is that this completely effaces the kind of whole conceptual and institutional history of both public order and public health, whereby they are very much intimately connected, right? And how the whole notion of the body politic, the health of the state, is predicated on the idea of kind of anti-Blackness and violence against racialized minorities as well, who are seen as dangerous to the health of the state, right? And so when I've been researching the Policing the Pandemic book and reading about the fact that, you know, Black people are not only more likely to die at the hands of the police, but also as a result of the pandemic, those two things are obviously intimately connected, right? It's not a coincidence. And I wanted to kind of get at this kind of beyond the material inequality argument, which is to say that, you know, Black people face material inequality and are therefore more likely to die as a result of the pandemic, but rather think about how our whole notions of health are tied to these notions of order, which then kind of legitimize police violence against Black communities. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not speaking to the zombie part of the question very well, but there's an elaboration there.
No, that was really wonderful. I'm wondering if Molly had a question, and I'm wondering if she could ask it live now.
Yeah, thank you. Am I heard by everybody?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I typed out a question and it disappeared when I was promoted, so I will do my best. It's a question for Brian, but I really appreciated all that you guys brought forward. It's really inspiring and beautiful to connect these ideas to the lived experience that we participants in the current social movement have been interacting with. So the question is, how can we apply your research on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism and like the history of the state doing those things in destabilizing the social reproduction to the Black Lives Revolution? Specifically, what can we do to protect our growing mutual aid networks against inevitable undermining and dismantling by state forces? That's it.
Okay. Yeah, I thank so much for that question. You know, that is one thing that we haven't talked about on this panel, but so much of the prior panels have dealt with, so that might actually be something that's useful. You know, everyone maybe could just maybe comment on like how the work that they've done in this, they've presented here is like inflected, you know, by the experiences, you know, of last year. And I can say just for me, the reason why I'm trying to think about these things is because in a lot of the analyses of that moment, or that however you want to describe it, it's ongoing or it's not ongoing, however, a lot of the limits that have been discussed have been around co-optation. You know, I'm wondering if there isn't another limit there, like around social reproduction. I'm not the only person to suggest that, you know, but I want to try and just use, you know, that's my grain of sand to the conversation. And also I want to problematize the question of just, you know, if we don't live in a moment where there is a kind of peasant smallholder, you know, surplus that can be drawn on, and if we really do think there is something important about the connection in between moments and social reproduction, like then it does devolve upon us the question of like, how do we solve that, you know? And I think there's lots of people in this chat or watching this who are doing that practical work. I don't have the answer. I think there's lots of people who are thinking about that, and sometimes but I don't know the answer to like how to protect those things. But I just am trying to raise that as like a question for deeper conversation, and also trying to put it in the counterinsurgency framework and asking the question of like, what are the emancipatory traditions that we can kind of look to for advice, you know, and help. There was a lot of panelists yesterday, you know, who have in the last 2 days who talked about kind of genealogies and giving gratitude to like, you know, things that ancestors and elders had taught them, you know, and I think that that's also something, you know, that I'm like trying to kind of frame. So, but, you know, that's my point of inflection with the George Floyd, you know, moment. I'm you know, would be curious to hear other people kind of reflect on how that's inflected their work, you know, for this panel.
I would just add to that idea of co-option is like this underlying kind of trend towards like bureaucratization, or like trying to create like legitimacy within like the structure that the state is like putting on a social like revolution, such as like an example being a mutual aid group that wants to apply for 501c3 status, and in doing so, like gets caught up in that same system that like abolitionists were like trying to dismantle. So thank you for that response. I'm out.
Do we have any other panelists who want to respond to Molly or Brian's sort of engagement there about the sort of question of mutual aid and the limits it faces in the current moment?
I mean, I would just echo with what Brian said and be talking to each other, you know, sharing ideas with as many other folks as you can to figure this out. They're always going to be coming for you, but you know, that shift to, I guess you know, a lot of people have been writing about that shift to nonprofit status. Ruthie Gilmore or Andrea Smith might be places to look to read about how that happens. It sounds like you're pretty already cognizant of how that works. So how then do you mobilize the resources to persist when persisting is hard? Actually, you get tired, and it has to be a kind of revolving. You know, you have to find ways to share who carries the energy forward, who steps in when someone else is tired or drifts away, so that you don't necessarily have to depend on outside resources, but can generate and circulate your own. However, you know, they, you know, on whatever register of those resources might be.
Yeah, I want to throw out a question that Sonali asked in the chat that I think touches sort of or resonates in some way with this current question, which she writes, as per Brian's point, if counterinsurgency is the production of disorder, yet the oikos, as Melayna said, is the site where a dominating order is consolidated, how can we think about a scalable form of social reproduction that doesn't just reproduce a dominant order? I think examples of Kurdistan and Zapatistas are interesting, but fall flat when trying to think about a revolutionary process across such a large territory as the US to limit ourselves to a single context. Can we really rely on, for example, hospitals to be replaced by makeshift forms of care? What about food production? Does this need repose the question of the need for order, something that can be reliably planned, et cetera, among revolutionary forces, as per Brian's point on the necessity of social reproduction for revolutionary forces? So this sort of question of scale, like I think that these improvised provisional forms of life, we often fall back on models of small scale things. But then, I mean, there's sort of this moment that Sonali is writing about that reminds me of, that I'm reminded of, which is, you know, the Invisible Committee asking, you know, what do we do with the nuclear plants? How do we, if we really want to destitute or render inoperable these apparatuses that control us, we also have to recognize that like permanent crisis management is part of the governance, and how do we attend to the sort of like scale of the challenge of actually dealing with the undoing of the forces that are holding back the catastrophe, even as they sort of reproduce the catastrophe in a more quotidian way. I'm sorry if I butchered your question there.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually, I mean, there was a part of Laura's talk where Laura was talking about how they often hurt one another. You know, and I think those are questions like, you know, those are complicated questions. And that's actually kind of why I began with the Dalton, is because, you know, Dalton was famously killed by his comrades. You know, the idea of hostility like contains a lot of, you know, there's a lot of folds inside of it. But also, like, I would say that there's a, you know, book, a recent book called Autonomy is in Our Hearts about the Zapatista experience. And one of the things that were kind of interesting about it, that it talks about, is like, you know, there's just so much failure in Zapatista communities, you know, and just, I think maybe, you know, part of the issue, part of what we are learning to do once again is just pose a problem, you know, and be okay with failing, but to repose the problem and be okay, you know, with attempting to kind of come up with solutions to things that are problems, you know. And that's one of the things I took away from that book, Autonomy is in Our Hearts, you know, is like that it has not been a linear speaking of temporality.
I just want to loop in, give Nicole an opportunity to jump in here because she said she had something to say.
I do have something to say. Can you guys hear me? But I wonder if I should drop it in favor of this suggestion in the chat that we organize a follow-up about post-conference continuation. That seems like a really wonderful idea. I'm not sure how to do that. I was going to make a point about scale as well. I really appreciated Sonali's comment. Maybe I'll speak for a minute and see what happens in the chat while I make this other point. I think, you know, yesterday I was thinking about the temporal difference between destituent power and the undercommons, if that is one way of distinguishing them. Today I'm thinking about the scalar difference. I'm moving from time to space. The scalar difference that we've encountered a couple times in this panel. And I would say that the distinction between, you know, the two most distinct papers on this panel for me, which are Edgar's and Laura's, is scale. Edgar is thinking on this very macro scale, and Laura's going all the way down to the micro, to people doing actual things. And this to me is always one of the trickiest questions for anarchist practice and for radical practice. And I don't know quite what to do with it, but I guess I have a deep love of the intricate and the intimate, the scale that you show us, Laura, and I have a big reluctance, Edgar, to embrace what you are offering, you know, in part because, and this will be boring to anybody who's talked to me about this stuff, that, you know, I cannot embrace a separation of state and market the way that your suggestion that, you know, the state is being, that sovereignty is fading and the market is sort of subsuming its functions. To me, those two things are operating hand in glove. They're inseparable from each other. They're inseparable historically and theoretically and in practice. Yeah, so maybe it's the question of scale that brings me back to not only to Laura's image, but also to Brian's suggestion that we focus on social reproduction, because that seems like a synonym for all the things we want, that, you know, all the ways we want to live our lives, all the ways that we hope not for survival, but what Fred Moten called thrival in this podcast I was listening to this morning that got mentioned in the chat yesterday, and millennials are killing capitalism. And I think that when you talk about social reproduction, the concept carries with it a kind of profound continuity. There is no possible break. There's no breakdown argument when you're talking about social reproduction, because you're always finding the threads of continuity when you're thinking through that. Like, with a breakdown with or without nostalgia is not present in conceptualizing what we want as social reproduction, or in conceptualizing counterinsurgency as an attack on social reproduction. So anyway, those are my thoughts about space and time. And now, Sam, whatever you want to do with all that amazing stuff that's happening in the chat.
I'll jump in to say, yes, I think the focus, the double focus that we got on social reproduction from Brian and Melayna is really important to keep in mind as a kind of crossing point or linchpin for many of these different scales that we're talking about. But I'm not an expert on the Zapatistas, but I have read some stuff, and what strikes me as really interesting about what they do is that they do multiple scales at once. And that even as they are bringing questions and new principles to the idea of state government, of the Mexican government, that's never separated from a question from reconsidering the question of how do we hold a meeting, right? How do we organize a meeting and do it? And so it seems to me that it's a matter of keeping both of those scales open, as part of what is being considered in each time one practices those things, that they're not mutually exclusive, but that you can't really have one without the other, maybe. But it seems to me that is in some ways, that's why in some ways it's nice to have a panel in which we have these different scales meeting in the middle, or crossing paths, so that we can think those things together. I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. I think you got it all wrong, Mikol. I think you're falsely accusing me of. No, I'm kidding. But you're accusing me of, first separating the state and the market. No, precisely. I'm saying, hey, no, the state, the market, and war itself, they develop an immanent relation, and so we need to, in other words, like politics cannot oppose a state as if we have the modern state, a leviathan that somehow could be recognized as a limited power. The problem is precisely the opposite, that the state has dissolved into the market and in social life and individual life. So I completely agree with you when you're accusing me of not, or when you're saying that they are both intricately linked. And the question of a scale, to me, it's also it's there, but it's, for me, when Laura is talking about the kids on the block and their I think you actually use the word survival as among the things that they do. They do survive, and so my mobilization of the category of survival is not the only thing left to do is just survive, and then we'll get killed eventually, so what are we going to do? No, it's the opposite. It's the embrace of life itself as the site of bodies, as living on, and in French, I think there's this survivance, in the sense of, it's life, it's more life out of life. It's you're living more than what you're living by living itself, right? So it's positive, and it's engaging. There's nothing. I certainly don't want to sound, again, just pessimistic or destructive here, right? So I don't know if that helps. Yeah. Anyway,
I think that's helpful, and I think there's a really nice segue to. I know we have very limited time, but there's a really great question that I think resonates with earlier moments, that I think ties together the question of life and social reproduction, and sort of some questions of the vitalist modes that have been thought earlier. So the question, it's from an anonymous person. Does life offer resources to help us live through the outside of the destituents around, meaning the blooming impurity of more than human life that the Avalanche Collective pointed to through the virus, the ways that many different forms of life are alive in the same spaces, through the same materials, overlapping? Then the anti-political challenge is not to find the right ways, spaces, and events, but in any context to invest and invoke the larger coherences that are actual and potential that we choose, and against the ones that we fight. But this is a mysterious process, as extremely contingent, will appropriately be different for each assemblage, each person. So then, what resources do Afro-diasporic and indigenous spiritual and religious practices offer a path towards that process of destituent discernment? So it's sort of a loaded question, but this question of life and some of these questions about spiritual practices that this last person just asked.
I'll just say real quickly, I not so much on the spiritual side of things, but I think there's a work of a Guatemalan indigenous Mayan scholar by the name of Gladys Sul that's super important for thinking about concrete practices of collective social reproduction. I would just highly recommend like looking there because it's really getting into like the nuts and bolts of a collective part of collective process of concrete social reproduction, and not even having to engage necessarily with like ideas of life and kind of theoretical, like I think it is theoretical, but at the same time, like it's very much just about like how does this occur within these communities, and also like what are tensions there that need to be critiqued and thought about further, which is what Gladys Sul does from a feminist perspective. So just highly recommend. You can find stuff in English. There are YouTube videos that quickly explain some of her work with English subtitles as well. So that's what I would contribute to that.
I would just add to what Brian is saying. There are a lot of thinkers who are now, well, two I can think of off the top of my head, Denise Ferreira da Silva and Elizabeth Pavanelli, who are also interested in the non-life divide. Like, what does that institute again for us that we need to call into question? So that might be also interesting to read, but there is a ton of writing. If you message me, I can send you things that I have read, looking at this question from indigenous perspectives. There's a lot of really interesting indigenous botany, among other things, by different people teaching in the US. So if you message me, I will gather resources and send them to you.
I think just to add very quickly as well, I think abolitionist politics and writing is also a really good starting point for thinking a lot of these things through, right? And I think, I'm not saying that this was the argument being presented here, but of course there is, a feeling that at the moment survival and surviving is in itself a radical act. And I suppose a politics or a thought of abolition, what that would do is to try and think, abolishing the conditions that make survival a radical act in itself, and trying to think outward from persisting and from survival, I think is also a really important task as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. If you haven't already, people are putting their emails into the chat to create some sort of follow-up thread, and we can sort of go through and glean some of the myriad of texts that have been shared there. So please do that. I think Melayna's final comment is a beautiful segue actually into the panel tomorrow, which is on spaces of life, right? So if we think of beyond the festivity of revolt, what sorts of enduring moments of living can be created? And so there's a range of different panelists thinking across different spaces and examples. And so I think moving from the sort of antagonism and hostility of existing within frames of counterinsurgency towards the sort of things that are managed to secure and continue to secure sites of social reproduction and survival. So thanks everyone for participating. It's been really exciting, and bearing with us as we try and figure out how to do this, having people go live. Thank you all so much.
Thanks to my fellow panelists. I really enjoyed your talks, and it was really nice to meet you.
Yeah,
likewise.
Likewise.
And for a lively chat box from the rest of you. Thank you.